Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The woods were thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of quiet that made everything feel more alive. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the moss-covered ground. Ava took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, though she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off about this trip. Maybe it was just the weight of everything back home, the dead-end job, the constant buzz of life that never seemed to stop. Maybe she just needed this. A break. Are we sure this is even the right trail? Liam asked, squinting up at the tangled trees. His brow furrowed in that way that made him look more like the anxious college kid he used to be, and less like the fast-paced entrepreneur he had become in the last year. Yeah, we're fine, Jasper said with a shrug, tugging his backpack higher on his shoulder. He wasn't much for nature, but he wasn't about to admit that. Instead, he made his usual joke about needing a signal to check his stocks, earning a chuckle from Maya, who was busy snapping photos of the foliage. Ava smiled at the sound. Maya's laugh was contagious, always had been. But today, even her smile couldn't push the unease away. It wasn't about being out in the woods with her best friends. It was just that everything in her life lately felt stagnant. She could almost hear the constant ticking of a clock in her head, urging her to get to the next thing, the next place. "It's just up ahead," she said, pulling herself out of her thoughts. "Come on, let's get to the well. I want to see what all the fuss is about." Jasper shot her a look. "You really believe in this old wishing well nonsense?" Ava laughed, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I don't know. I'm curious. They say it grants wishes. It'd be fun, right? A little magic never hurt anyone." Maya grinned, her camera hanging loosely from her neck. "I'm all in. Can you imagine? A wish to make all my photos perfect? I could be a professional by next week." Elliot, the quietest of the group, glanced around uneasily. He wasn't much for the stories people told about the woods. But he trusted Ava, and he could see how much she needed this, how much they all did. "Yeah, sure," he muttered. "But if it's really magic, I'm definitely wishing for a vacation. I'm getting sick of these woods already." They continued walking, their laughter echoing faintly through the trees. Ava's heart felt a little lighter with every step. Maybe this was just what she needed, something different, something that didn't feel so predictable. Eventually, they came to a clearing. The trees parted to reveal a stone well, overgrown with ivy and moss. It looked ancient, its surface worn and weathered by time. The air around it felt strangely still, as if even the forest itself held its breath. The group stopped, gazing at the well in silence. "Is this it?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava nodded, stepping closer to the well. She ran her fingers along the stone, its rough texture cool against her skin. "This is it," she confirmed, feeling a flicker of excitement run through her veins. "The stories say it grants wishes." "I don't know," Jasper muttered, eyeing the well warily. "There's something off about this place. It feels like it's been forgotten for a reason." Maya waved him off, taking a step forward. Or maybe it's just waiting for someone who knows what they want. She gave Ava a look, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "You know what to do." Ava smiled. She'd heard the stories about the well that could grant one wish for anyone brave enough to throw a coin into it. Her friends had been teasing her about it for days, telling her she'd probably wish for something crazy, something over the top. And maybe they were right. Maybe this was her chance to shake things up. "All right," she said, pulling a coin from her pocket. "Here goes." One by one, they each tossed a coin into the well, each making their own wish. Ava's coin made a soft clink as it hit the bottom, and she closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the adventure she'd been craving. She wasn't sure what she wanted exactly, but maybe this would be the start of something new, something exciting. She opened her eyes to see the others standing around her. Liam had a bemused smile on his face, while Maya was already busy snapping photos of the well. Jasper looked skeptical, as usual, and Elliot gazed nervously toward the trees. His shoulders hunched as though the silence in the air was too thick for him to ignore. "Well," Ava said, brushing her hands off, "that's done. Let's see what happens." But as she turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind picked up. It whipped through the trees and made the leaves rustle and sway. The ground beneath their feet trembled faintly, like a heartbeat echoing in the earth. It was a brief moment, a flicker of something darker, before everything fell back into silence. Ava froze. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. The fire crackled, the flames flickering as the others fell into a brief silence. But Ava couldn't help herself. "What would you wish for, then, Elliot?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. He hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "Peace, I guess," he said quietly. "It's been a lot lately, with work and everything." He ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment, Ava could see the exhaustion in his eyes, an unease that had only been growing over the past few months. Maya leaned in. "Well, your wish is kind of easy to get, right? I mean, peace is just a state of mind, isn't it?" Elliot gave a small, forced smile. "Not always." The night stretched on, and the conversation continued to flow in the usual easy rhythms, but the air felt thick, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. Ava tried to focus on her friends, but the more she tried to dismiss the strange feeling, the more it seemed to haunt her thoughts. She glanced up at the stars, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. The flicker of the fire, the low hum of the forest at night, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But then she heard it, so faint she thought it was a trick of the wind at first, but unmistakable, a soft whispering. Her heart skipped a beat. She blinked, trying to focus. The whisper wasn't coming from her friends, it was coming from the woods. The others hadn't heard it, at least not yet. They were still talking about their plans for the future, the usual banter that they always fell into when they were together. Ava stood up abruptly, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. "Anyone else hear that?" she asked, voice tight. "Hear what?" Liam looked up from his phone, a confused expression on his face. "Seriously, Ava?" Jasper rolled his eyes. "You've been staring at that damn well all afternoon. Now you're hearing things." "No, listen." Ava took a step away from the fire, her heart racing in her chest. There was again the soft, almost unintelligible whisper just on the edge of her hearing. The others were looking at her now, concern creeping into their faces. "I don't hear anything," Maya said, standing up with a little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe it's just the wind." Ava glanced over her shoulder toward the dark outline of the trees. The whispering continued, growing a little louder this time, as if calling her name. "Ava!" The voice was unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" she asked again, this time her voice barely above a whisper. Jasper stood up, rolling his eyes. "Okay, now this is getting creepy. Let's just get some sleep, all right?" But Ava couldn't look away from the woods. There was something in the air, something watching them. The whisper sounded like it was for her, pulling her attention with a strange force she couldn't explain. And that's when she saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, in the shadows, a figure stood watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. "Guys!" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling as she took a slow step backward. "There's someone out there." Liam, who had been checking his phone again, raised an eyebrow. "Ava, stop. There's no one out there." But Ava knew what she saw. The figure was still there, its form distorted by the shadows, as if it didn't quite belong to the world she knew. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Ava," it wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a pull, something that wanted her. "Ava, stop!" Maya snapped, reaching out to grab her arm, but it was too late. The darkness in the trees seemed to ripple like it was alive. And then, in a blink, the figure's gone, vanished into the night. Her heart was pounding, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear. The group stood there, frozen, the air suddenly much colder than before. And somewhere, in the distance, the whisper continued. The air around them felt thick with a silence that clung to their skin, oppressive and unnatural. Ava's pulse raced, the eerie whisper still echoing faintly in her ears. Her eyes darted back to the trees, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there now. Just the heavy, still air. "Ava, you're freaking me out," Liam said, a forced chuckle escaping his lips as he ran a hand through his hair. But his nervousness was clear, his eyes darting uneasily to the forest behind her. There's no one out there, but Ava wasn't so sure. The figure she had seen, it had been so real. She could still feel the weight of it in the pit of her stomach, a cold presence that lingered, unshakable. "I saw something," she said, her voice barely a whisper, still trembling. Maya stepped forward, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks. You've been staring at that well all day, remember? Maybe it's starting to get to you." Ava didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the tree line. She had to be imagining it, right? But there was a weight in the air, a palpable heaviness that made it hard to breathe. She swallowed hard, trying to shake off the sense of dread creeping over her. Elliot was the first to break the uneasy silence. "Maybe we should call it a night," he said quietly, his eyes still on the woods. "Get some sleep." Ava nodded slowly, too rattled to argue. As much as she wanted to dismiss what she had seen, a part of her knew there was something wrong. But she didn't want to ruin the trip for the others. They'd all been looking forward to this, and she didn't want to make it awkward. "Yeah, you're probably right," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She turned back to the fire and sat down, trying to focus on the warmth of the flames, but the coldness in her chest wouldn't fade. The others settled around the campfire, the conversation shifting back to trivial matters. Maya and Jasper were already talking about their plans for the next morning, and Liam was scrolling through his phone again, but Ava's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching them, waiting. She tried to focus on the fire, the way the flames flickered and crackled, but it was hard to ignore the sense that something was wrong. The air felt too still, too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every gust of wind felt like it was carrying whispers, voices she couldn't quite understand, but they were there, tugging at her consciousness. And then, just as she thought the night would drag on in suffocating silence, the whisper returned. Clearer this time. Louder. "Ava." Her heart lurched in her chest, and she stood up so abruptly that her chair tipped over. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, spinning around to face the others. The group paused, their eyes wide. "I heard it," Maya said, her voice low and tense. Liam's face had gone pale. "What the hell? We're all just hearing things now." "No," Ava said, her voice shaky. This isn't in my head. I know I'm not crazy. It's like someone's out there, calling my name." A silence hung between them, thick and uncomfortable. Elliot looked like he might say something, but his lips trembled, and he fell silent. Jasper stood up, rubbing his hands together. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "There's no one out there. It's just the wind. This place is old, right? Old woods, old myths. It's all just stories." But Ava wasn't convinced. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness between the trees, where she'd seen that shadow move earlier. She could feel its presence like a weight pressing against her chest, suffocating in its intensity. The whisper came again, this time unmistakable, a voice that wasn't wind or the trees. It was human. Clear. "Ava. Ava," Maya shouted, grabbing her arm as Ava took a step toward the trees. "Stop it. Stop, please." But Ava couldn't stop herself. Something was drawing her forward, like an invisible thread tugging at her heart. She had to know who was calling her name. She had to know what was out there. Before anyone could stop her, she was walking, her feet crunching against the fallen leaves as she moved toward the edge of the clearing. The others shouted after her, but their voices were swallowed up by the night, by the deepening darkness of the forest. "Ava, wait!" Liam's voice cracked with panic, but she couldn't hear him anymore. Her mind was focused on one thing, the whisper. It was getting louder now, no longer a faint echo, but a call, a pull. And then, through the trees, she saw it again, the figure. Not just a shadow anymore, but something tangible, dark and ethereal, like it didn't quite belong to this world. The shape of a person standing still in the moonlight, motionless and waiting. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just some figment of her imagination. This was real. "Ava," the figure called again, its voice not just in her ears but in her mind, the words sinking into her very bones. She stepped forward, almost instinctively, as if she had no choice. But before she could take another step, a hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Don't." Elliot's voice was a sharp whisper, his grip tight and urgent. "Please, Ava. Something's wrong. We need to go." Ava's eyes locked with his, her heart pounding in her chest. But she couldn't break free from the pull of the figure. "Let me go," she whispered, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go back. "Ava, please." Elliot's voice cracked, his hand trembling as it gripped her tighter. "It's not real. You're seeing things. We're leaving now. Come on, please." The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, and Ava's vision blurred. The figure seemed to shimmer and fade, its outline twisting in the air as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. But it was still there, still calling to her. And then, in the distance, something moved, an unnatural shift in the trees, a shadow, too large to be human. Something was coming. Ava took a step back, suddenly realizing what was happening. Whatever this was, it wasn't just the well. It was more than that. The pull, the whispers, the figure, wasn't something she could wish away. They weren't just trapped in the woods. They had awakened something. And now, it was coming for them all. Ava's heart raced in her chest as she looked over her shoulder at Elliot, who still had a tight grip on her wrist. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, but she could see the desperation in his eyes. "Ava, we need to leave. Now," he said, voice shaking. She shook her head, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to do, what to think anymore. The figure, the shadows in the trees, hadn't disappeared. They were still there, lurking just beyond the firelight, growing closer with every passing second. The whispering wasn't just in her ears anymore, it was inside her head. "Ava." She pulled her wrist from Elliot's grasp, stepping backward into the clearing. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of the situation. Was she hallucinating? Was she losing her mind? But then, in the distance, she saw it. The movement. A dark shape shifting in the trees, something tall, something wrong. "Get away from it," Elliot shouted, his voice cracking. "It's not real, Ava. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." But the more he spoke, the more distant his words sounded. The forest seemed to swallow everything, pulling her deeper into the dark. She wasn't sure if she could trust her own senses anymore, but one thing was clear: whatever was out there in the woods wasn't human. It was something else. The figure moved again, stepping out from behind the trees, revealing itself in full. It wasn't a person, not in the way Ava understood it. The shape was too fluid, its features indistinct, as if the shadows themselves had come alive. The longer Ava stared at it, the more it seemed to shimmer, as if it were made of liquid darkness, constantly shifting and changing. "Ava!" The voice came again, soft but insistent. Something in her snapped, a strange calm settling over her. She didn't know if it was terror or something else, but she felt an overwhelming urge to approach the thing. "No!" Elliot screamed, his hand latching on her arm once more. "You can't!" Before he could pull her back, the figure stepped forward, its presence like a weight on her chest. It was close now, close enough for her to feel its coldness, like the air had turned frigid. She couldn't move. It was as though her body was no longer hers to command, paralyzed by the sheer force of its presence. "Ava!" The whisper was louder now, and it wasn't just in her head. The voice came from it, from the figure, low and guttural. "Come." Closer. Ava took a step forward, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick forest floor. "Ava, stop!" Maya's voice pierced the night, sharp and panicked. But it felt so far away, like she was hearing it from underwater. Her footfall was the only sound in the clearing, the only thing left in her mind. She didn't know why she kept moving. She didn't know why she couldn't stop herself. But then, just as the figure was about to reach out to her, the trees behind it stirred. Something shifted in the shadows. A louder, more tangible movement, like a large creature shifting through the underbrush. It wasn't just a figure anymore. Something was coming. Something much bigger. The figure paused, its form rippling like smoke caught in the wind. Then, in a voice like a storm, it spoke, no longer whispering but commanding. "Leave." Ava's chest constricted, and her body jerked as if an invisible force had yanked her back. She stumbled, her hands clawing the air in a futile attempt to maintain balance. The world spun, and for a brief moment, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, an overwhelming sense of dread, of being watched, of being trapped in a place where there was no escape. And then, just as suddenly, the pain vanished. She gasped for air, her mind clouded and dizzy. She tried to scream, but her throat felt tight, like the air itself had thickened, choking her words. "Ava, come on!" Elliot shouted, his voice desperate. "Please!" But when she looked around, she didn't see him, or Maya, or any of the others. The clearing was empty now, the fire nothing more than a dying ember. The trees around her seemed to close in, the shadows long and distorted. The sky was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness that swallowed everything. She turned in a circle, trying to find her friends, but they were nowhere to be found. The whispering returned, louder than ever. "Come." It was coming from behind her now, and she couldn't stop herself from turning toward it. She was moving again, even though she didn't want to. The pull was stronger now, irresistible. She stumbled into the trees, her feet stumbling over roots and branches. She couldn't see, couldn't think. Only the voice, the whisper, the call was all that mattered. The darkness around her thickened, and her vision blurred. The whisper was everywhere, now a cacophony, crashing over her like waves. "Ava! Ava! Ava!" But then, in the distance, she saw them. Her friends, standing in a line, just beyond the trees, their faces hidden in the shadows. They weren't looking at her. They were staring ahead, frozen, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Something in the air shifted, like a crackling of energy that set her nerves on edge. And in the silence that followed, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. A low, guttural sound filled the air. Something was coming. The shadows around her seemed to ripple, and as Ava's heart raced in her chest, she realized the truth. They hadn't just made a wish. They had unleashed something, and now it was after them all. Ava's pulse hammered in her ears as the ground trembled beneath her feet. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the whispering, once a mere voice, now felt like 1,000 voices, all calling her name in unison. Her vision swam, the world around her darkening with each breath she took. She turned toward her friends, or at least the shadowy figures that looked like them. They stood motionless, their faces blank and expressionless, eyes wide open but unseeing. Ava's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she took a step toward them. "Elliot? Liam? Maya?" she called out, her voice ragged with fear. But none of them responded. Their bodies remained frozen, staring into the darkness that stretched behind them. "Ava!" The voice was closer now, its rasping tone almost physical, like it was crawling under her skin, burrowing into her thoughts. She turned toward the sound. Out of the shadows, something emerged, something large, monstrous. It wasn't a person anymore, not even close. It was a mass of shifting, inky darkness, pulsating and alive, its forms stretching and warping in ways that made Ava's stomach churn. It was like a creature made of pure night, something that didn't belong in this world. Her breath caught in her throat as it moved, slow and deliberate, toward her. The whispering grew louder, and then something clicked inside her, the same pull she had felt earlier, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was an urge. She couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved forward, her legs stiff as if controlled by something other than her will. She stumbled, but she couldn't resist, couldn't turn away. The darkness in front of her seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the pulse of some ancient, terrible heart. Ava, the voice again. Closer. Closer. Her chest tightened, her throat dry. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. She wanted to run, to tear herself away from whatever force was pulling her in, but she couldn't. Her body didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the shadows. And then a voice, real, human, cut through the blackness. Stop! It was Liam. His voice was frantic, desperate, filled with raw terror. In a daze, Ava's eyes snapped to him. He was there, standing a few feet away, his expression wild. But the others, Maya, Jasper, Elliot, they were still frozen in place. As though they were part of the creature's web, trapped and unmoving. Liam took a step forward, his hand shaking. Ava, please. We need to get out of here. This isn't you. But Ava couldn't answer. The darkness was all-consuming, and it wasn't just the creature anymore. It was everywhere. The trees around them were twisting, their shapes warped and unnatural. The night sky had vanished, leaving only the endless void. Liam stepped closer, his eyes frantic, his breath shallow. Ava, listen to me. It's all wrong. We made a mistake. We need to get out of here. We need to... Before he could finish, the shadow at the center of the clearing moved again, its massive form expanding, reaching for Ava. She screamed, but the sound was lost in a shriek of wind that began to howl through the trees. It wasn't just wind, it was the sound of something tearing at the fabric of reality itself. Ava, Liam cried again, his voice breaking. Please don't do this. Don't. The creature's form surged toward her, and everything seemed to slow. She could feel the weight of it, an oppressive, crushing force that threatened to suffocate her. The whispering filled her mind, drowning out everything else. Come to me. Her eyes locked onto the figure, the thing at the center of it all. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were endless voids, blacker than anything Ava had ever seen, cold and hungry. And then, a surge of pure, unrelenting fear struck her heart. It wasn't just the pull of the creature. It was what lay behind it, the other thing, the true source of the terror. The thing that had been waiting, hidden in the deepest corners of the world, biding its time. Ava couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was stumble back, her feet dragging her away from the creature, from the darkness, as her mind screamed in horror. She reached out for Liam, but her body wasn't hers to control anymore. It was too late. Ava, Liam shouted again, but the words faded into the oppressive roar of the wind. She tried to fight it, tried to pull away, but something larger than herself was pulling her deeper into the abyss. The darkness was swallowing her. She closed her eyes, the wind howling around her, her limbs unresponsive. She felt cold. She felt empty. There was nothing left but the crushing weight of the void. And then, just as she thought she would be lost forever, a sharp, blinding light cut through the shadows, breaking apart the nightmare. She gasped, and for a moment, everything went silent. The darkness stopped. The wind ceased. Her eyes blinked open. She was standing again, in the clearing, the fire flickering beside her. The others were there, staring at her in shock. Ava, Maya asked quietly, her voice trembling. Ava's breath was shaky as she looked around. Everything seemed normal, The trees, the fire, her friends, all of it was just as it had been before. No shadows, no darkness, but she could still feel it. It was still there, the cold, the emptiness. The shadows were waiting, watching. W, what happened? Ava stammered, her voice trembling as she took a step backward. Liam reached out for her, his face pale. Ava, are you okay? You were just standing there, like you were. Somewhere else. Ava didn't know how to explain. She didn't know what was real anymore. She turned, her eyes scanning the woods around them, looking for any sign of what had happened. But the darkness was gone. At least, she thought it was. But deep down, she knew something far worse had been awakened. And it was only a matter of time before it came back for them. The whispers, she realized, had never truly stopped. They were only waiting for the right moment to return. And the thing that had followed them home, it was still out there. Ava's heart continued to race as she stood in the clearing, trying to piece together what had just happened. The sudden shift in reality, one moment, she was pulled toward the dark figure. The next, everything was normal again. But it didn't feel normal. The air felt wrong. The whispers still lingered at the edges of her mind, too faint to understand, but too constant to ignore. Ava, Liam's voice was gentle now, full of concern. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out, but she pulled away slightly, feeling like she might break into pieces if anyone touched her. Ava, talk to me, he urged, his face full of worry. You were gone, just standing there like you weren't even there. What happened? I don't know, she murmured, her voice shaking. There was something, a shadow, a figure. It called my name. I couldn't stop myself. I just went to it. Maya stepped forward, her face tight with apprehension. What are you talking about? We were all standing here, and you were just staring, like you were in a trance. And then you screamed and collapsed, like something pulled you into the ground. Ava's breath hitched as she remembered the sensation. The pull. It had been so powerful, so overwhelming. She had felt it deep in her bones, in her soul, like she was meant to go to it. Whatever it was. It's not real, Elliot said suddenly, his voice brittle as he stood by the edge of the firelight, his arms crossed tight across his chest. We've been here too long. The isolation, the legends, they've all gotten to us. This isn't some supernatural thing, Ava. There's nothing out there. Ava looked at him, her chest heavy with disbelief. How could he say that when she had felt it? When she knew something had been watching them? She had seen the shadows, heard the whispers, felt the darkness closing in. How could they ignore it? There's something here. Elliot, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Something worse than just stories. It's real. Liam's hand gently touched her arm. We don't have to stay here, he said softly. We can leave right now. We'll go back. No more messing around with whatever this is. Ava opened her mouth to argue, to say that leaving wouldn't solve anything, but before she could speak, the ground trembled again. A low, distant rumble. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as a wave of dread washed over her. This wasn't a storm. It wasn't the wind. It was something more. Something that was coming. A thick shadow shifted at the edge of the trees, just outside the firelight. It was nothing more than a silhouette, but Ava could see it clearly. The shape was long, far too tall to be human, and its outline seemed to ripple, as if it was being pulled in every direction. Ava, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. What is that? The whispering returned, but this time it was louder. More urgent, more menacing. Ava, the figure in the trees moved. Slowly, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Ava's breath caught in her throat as her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted in place. Ava, the voice came again, closer now, the air around them growing cold, suffocating. She wasn't sure if it was the thing in the trees or something in her own mind, but she couldn't look away. It was calling to her again. It was pulling at her like gravity, and everything inside her screamed that she had to resist, but she couldn't. It was impossible. Ava, don't. Liam's voice was frantic. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but she felt weightless, like the world around her was fading. Her vision blurred, and she was drawn forward despite everything in her fighting against it. The ground beneath her began to shift, cracking like it was splitting apart. Her heart raced as the darkness seemed to come alive around her. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were moving now, twisting and slithering in ways that shouldn't be possible. Liam shouted her name again, but it was a distant, fading sound. Ava's feet dragged through the dirt, and her body was like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "Please," she begged, but the words felt empty, hollow. "I can't stop it. I can't." The creature stepped from the trees, its form twisting and rippling, its edges blurry, like it was shifting between worlds. It had no face, only darkness, pure and deep, swirling as though it was made from the night itself. Its voice echoed in her mind. "You belong to me now." Ava's eyes went wide with terror, but her body didn't obey her. It was as though her will had shattered, leaving her at the mercy of whatever force controlled this creature. The darkness reached for her, tendrils of shadow stretching out toward her like hands, cold and merciless. But then, a sharp sound cut through the air, a cracking noise that sliced through the stillness. Suddenly, a bright light, blinding, pure, flashed across the clearing, illuminating everything. The shadows recoiled, screeching as if burned by the light. Ava gasped, her heart pounding as the darkness around her seemed to scream and writhe, disoriented and forced to retreat. The figure faltered, its form losing its solid shape, flickering in and out of existence. "Run!" Elliot shouted, pulling at Ava's arm, his grip frantic. "Run! Now!" Ava didn't need any more convincing. She snapped back to herself, adrenaline surging through her body. Her legs were still weak, but she pushed herself to move, stumbling away from the creature, her breath shallow and frantic. The others, Liam, Maya, Jasper, they were already moving, their faces pale with terror. They didn't hesitate. They were running too. Behind them, the creature howled, a terrible, inhuman sound that split the night air. Ava risked a glance back, but the darkness was retreating, pulled back by the light. But it wasn't gone. It was only waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. They sprinted toward the campsite's exit, toward the trail that would take them out of the woods, but Ava knew, deep down, that they weren't safe. Not yet. Not ever. The whispers were still there, in her mind, clawing at her thoughts, the pull still strong. The forest might be behind them, but it hadn't let go. The creature had only retreated into the shadows, waiting for the moment it would return. And this time, it wouldn't be stopped. The wind howled around them as they ran, the night pressing in on all sides. The trees were now distorted shapes, their branches twisted and clawing at the air like skeletal hands. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest burning with each step. They had to get out of the woods, out of the reach of whatever was chasing them. But the terror, the weight of it, still hung in the air as if the very ground beneath their feet was alive, hungry for them. Behind them, the howls of the creature echoed in the distance, guttural and distorted, like something trying to rip its way into the world. Ava didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The darkness was still there, somewhere, stretching its fingers into the corners of her mind. Liam was the first to break the silence. "This isn't real. It can't be. It can't be real." He sounded almost frantic, his voice cracking as he pushed through the underbrush. Ava couldn't answer him, couldn't form words. The words felt too small, too meaningless. They just seen something that didn't belong in this world. There was no denying it. The thing in the woods, the pull, the darkness, it was all real. The path was narrow, twisting around trees and roots, but they were all pushing forward, not stopping to rest, not even to breathe. The moonlight barely broke through the thick canopy above them, and with every step, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more oppressive. "Ava, Maya's voice cut through the silence, a desperate cry. Ava glanced at her, seeing the wild look in her friend's eyes, the same fear she felt coiling in her own chest. "Do you hear that?" Ava paused, straining to listen. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet. The wind had died down. The only sound now was the pounding of their footsteps, their breathing quick, shallow. But then she heard it. Faint at first, like a whisper, but unmistakable. It was the same voice, the one that had been calling her name. Ava. Her skin prickled, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. The whisper was so close, it felt like it was right next to her. It had followed them. "No," she muttered under her breath, her legs pumping faster. "It's not real. It's not real." Liam grabbed her arm, yanking her to the side as she stumbled. "Don't listen to it. Keep moving." But it was so hard not to listen. The voice was inside her head now, echoing in the deepest parts of her mind. It wasn't just a whisper, it was an urge, a compulsion that twisted her thoughts. She could feel it tugging at her, pulling her away from the path, into the darkness. "Ava." The voice was louder now, clearer. She tried to scream, but the words got stuck in her throat. Her eyes darted around, but all she saw were shadows, shifting and flickering like something alive, watching her from the corners of her vision. And then she saw it again, the figure standing just beyond the trees, waiting for her. Its form was faint, just a silhouette, but she knew it was there, watching. Her heart thudded in her chest as she struggled to keep moving, to break free of the pull. But with each step, the shadows around her grew deeper, darker. It was as if the forest was closing in on them, pushing them into the waiting arms of whatever it was. "Ava." Maya cried out again, this time more urgent. "Look." Ava's eyes snapped to her friend, but Maya wasn't looking at her. She was staring past her into the trees. There, in the distance, she saw something. The same shape, the figure from before, but it wasn't alone. There were others. Figures emerging from the shadows, tall, dark, and shifting, like the night itself was alive. They were watching them, waiting, and then one of them moved. In an instant, the world around them shifted. The trees began to warp and twist, as if they were bending to the will of the dark figures. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, like the earth itself was trembling. "It's coming." Elliot's voice trembled. He sounded like he was on the edge of panic. "We need to run. Now." They didn't need any more prompting. The moment they saw the figures move, they bolted. Ava's legs screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. Her feet pounded against the earth as she pushed herself forward, feeling the ground tremble beneath her. The trees around them began to warp and shift, their branches reaching out like hands, grabbing at them, pulling them back into the dark. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping, demanding. She risked another glance back. The figures were closer now, moving with unnatural speed. They were no longer just shadows. They were things. Real things. Things that should not exist. One of the figures let out a low, guttural growl, and in an instant, it was on them. "Ava, run," Liam shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. His grip was like iron, but the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. They ran, through the forest, through the shifting darkness. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps. The air was too thick. Her thoughts were too clouded, and she couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. Another figure appeared, a flash of movement in the corner of her vision. It was blocking their path. She saw its eyes, pale, cold eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It opened its mouth in a wide, toothless grin, but there was nothing human about it. Ava screamed, stumbling backward as the thing reached out for her. But before it could touch her, Liam lunged forward, pushing her behind him. "Go, now!" The creature hissed, its shape flickering and shifting, but Liam didn't hesitate. He dragged Ava away toward a narrow break in the trees. And then, with all the strength she could muster, she ran. The world around her was collapsing, warping, and she could feel the shadows closing in again, like the forest itself was coming alive, suffocating them. But then light bright, burning, overwhelming. The moon shone down through the trees in a beam of silver, breaking through the darkness, pushing it back. They were almost there, just a few more steps. But as they neared the edge of the clearing, the ground trembled again, stronger than before. The trees began to crack and split, the air charged with an unnatural energy, and Ava felt it again, the pull. The deep, unrelenting pull. It was no longer just the shadows. It was everything. She stopped in her tracks, her breath coming in jagged sobs. She turned toward the others, but the words that came out of her mouth were weak, desperate. We can't outrun it. It's everywhere. And then the darkness closed in again. The air felt electric, vibrating with a deep, unsettling energy as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Ava's heart pounded painfully in her chest, and her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The creatures, the shadows, the pull, it was all real. More than real. It was like the forest itself had become a living, breathing thing, hungry for them. Liam grabbed her arm, pulling her forward with desperate urgency. We can't stop. Keep moving. But Ava couldn't tear her eyes away from the shifting darkness closing in on them. The whispering had grown deafening now, screeching, hissing voices, and every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the nightmare. The trees twisted in unnatural shapes, their branches stretching out like claws, trying to drag them back into the heart of the forest. Maya screamed, her voice high-pitched and frantic, as she stumbled forward, tripping over the uneven ground. What do we do? We're trapped. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Ava could feel the cold sweat on her skin, her legs shaking beneath her. She wanted to shout, to tell them to run, but she didn't even know if running would do anything. The darkness was everywhere now, seeping into her bones, and she could feel it pulling her, like it was trying to drag her under, to swallow her whole. We need to get to the clearing. Elliot shouted, his voice strained. He was looking around frantically, as if the trees themselves might give way to some escape. There's no other way out. The trail this way. But Ava knew that the clearing was no longer an escape. The thing in the shadows, the creature they had seen, was waiting for them. Whatever it was, whatever had been pulling at her, it wasn't something they could outrun. It was hunting them, and it was far older and more powerful than anything they could comprehend. The ground beneath them rumbled again, deeper this time, like the very earth was groaning in agony. The air crackled with a static charge, and Ava felt a terrible weight pressing down on her chest. I don't think we can outrun it, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. She had no idea if the others heard her, or if they would even care. There was no place left to run. The creatures were closing in. They could hear them now, their movements like slithering shadows, reaching for them with cold, ethereal hands. Liam stopped in his tracks, his chest heaving, eyes wide with a mix of panic and determination. Then what? What do we do? His hand tightened around hers, but Ava could feel his grip weakening. He was just as terrified as she was. I don't know, Ava muttered, her breath coming in quick gasps. She looked around, her mind racing. They were surrounded. There was no escape, no way out. But then something shifted. A faint glow, a flicker of light. Ava blinked, her thoughts momentarily clearing. She turned her head toward the source of a light, which seemed to come from the far side of the clearing. Through the thick trees, just past the edge of the shifting shadows, there was something, someone, a figure standing still, almost serene amidst the chaos. It was a man dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by the faint glow that surrounded him. The creature's hissing grew louder, but Ava's attention was pulled to the figure. She had to focus. She had to see who or what this was. Who is that? Maya whispered in awe, as if drawn toward the glow like a moth to a flame. I don't know, Ava muttered, her feet carrying her forward despite the instinct in her chest screaming to run in the opposite direction. But she couldn't stop. It was like something about this figure, the way he was standing, unmoving, pulled at her, as if he had the answers to all the terror they were feeling. Liam reached out to stop her. "Ava, wait, don't." But it was too late. Ava had already taken a step toward the figure, and she could feel the darkness creeping in behind her. The whispers were growing louder, the hissing voices more frantic. Something about the way the figure was standing, it didn't feel right. It was like he was beckoning her, drawing her in with his unsettling calm. The closer she got, the colder the air became. Then, as if on cue, the man turned his head, and Ava froze. His eyes were glowing, white, bright, unnatural. No pupils, no iris, just pure, blinding light. But what really made her stomach turn was the grin. It was too wide, too sharp, like it had been carved into his face. His lips parted, revealing jagged, black teeth. And then, in a voice that sent a chill down her spine, the figure spoke. "Ava, you have come." Her body stiffened as the words echoed through her mind. The others had stopped too, now too far behind her to reach her in time. "Stay away from him," Liam called out from behind her, his voice a mixture of fear and desperation. But Ava couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the man with the glowing eyes. His presence was suffocating, and yet she felt strangely compelled to listen to him. "He has called you," the figure continued, his grin widening. "And now you'll be his." Ava's heart slammed in her chest. Her mind screamed to her to run, to flee from this thing, but her body wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed, as if the very air around her had solidified into something thick and suffocating. The whispers were louder now, pressing in from all sides. Liam's voice was frantic now, desperate as he tried to reach her. "Ava, no. Snap out of it. Don't listen to him. This is a trap." But it was already too late. The figure's grin grew wider, if that was even possible. "It is not a trap," he said, his voice low and smooth, like dark silk. "It is your destiny. You are mine now, and there is no escaping what is coming." And in that moment, Ava felt it. A sharp, unnatural pull, stronger than before. It tore at her chest, like invisible strings were tugging her toward him. The figure's hands moved impossibly fast, and his fingers reached out for her, the cold light of his eyes blinding. Before she could scream, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. The figure's hand had pierced through her heart, and the world around her went black. Ava's body froze, her breath caught in her throat as the cold, sharp pain radiated out from the spot where the figure's hand had pierced her chest. Her heart, no, her soul, felt as if it were being ripped apart, torn from her body by some invisible force. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known, and yet, strangely, it didn't feel like it was coming from her own body. It felt like the world itself was breaking around her. Time slowed, stretching into an eternity as she stared into the figure's glowing eyes. His grin was no longer just unsettling, it was predatory. Like he had already claimed her, like she was nothing more than a piece of his dark collection. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. And then the whispers came back. They were louder now, louder than the pain, louder than her fear, swirling around her mind like an endless storm. It was as if every shadow, every fragment of darkness in the world was whispering to her, calling to her. They were all there, all around her. "You are ours now. Embrace the darkness. You belong to us." Her vision blurred, her mind spinning, and then, without warning, something snapped inside her. A surge of cold energy shot through her body, and with it, a wave of realization. She wasn't alone. She wasn't helpless. There was something else inside her, something that had been buried deep within her all along. It had been there from the moment she had stepped into the woods, from the moment the shadows had first called her. A surge of power that wasn't her own pushed back against the figure's grip. The pain was still there, a constant pressure at her chest, but now it was fading, pushed back by something fierce and primal that Ava had never known she possessed. The figure's eyes flickered with confusion, but that confusion quickly morphed into something darker, more sinister. "No," he hissed, his voice twisting with anger. "You cannot resist." But Ava was no longer listening to him. The whispers, those ancient, maddening voices, grew fainter as the surge of energy within her intensified. Something within her fought back. She felt herself break free. Ava gasped as she felt her limbs return to her control. She wasn't fully aware of what was happening, how she was doing it, what power was fueling her, but she didn't care. She pushed against the figure, slamming her hands into his chest with all the strength she could summon. The figure staggered back, his eyes widening in shock. The glow of his pupils dimmed for a moment, and in that brief moment of vulnerability, Ava shoved herself away from him, gasping for air. "Ava!" Liam's voice reached her through the haze, sharp and panicked. She turned to see him running toward her, his eyes wide with terror and relief. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. "We need to get out of here," Liam shouted, his grip tight. "We have to." Before he could finish his sentence, the ground beneath them shook violently. Ava stumbled, and the air grew thick, too thick to breathe. It was as if the very forest was closing in around them, suffocating them. The figure let out a scream, a twisted sound that was neither human nor anything from this world. His form flickered in and out of focus, a mass of writhing darkness that could barely hold itself together. "You cannot escape," the figure snarled, his voice like the scraping of nails on glass. "You belong to me, and when you fall, the darkness will consume you." Ava's heart pounded, but something within her stirred again, a deep, buried instinct, a primal urge that screamed for survival. She reached out, her fingers trembling, but this time her hand wasn't aiming for the figure. It was aimed at the ground beneath her feet. And then the light came again, a bright, brilliant light that cut through the choking darkness like a knife. It wasn't the moon this time, not the cold, distant glow. It was pure, unrelenting burning. The light surged outward from Ava's hand, a pulse of energy that radiated across the clearing. The trees groaned, their branches snapping back as if the very force of the light was forcing the woods to retreat. The figure shrieked in agony, his form unraveling like a thread, being pulled apart, his glowing eyes flickering out. Ava could feel the weight of the darkness lifting, as though the grip it had on her was loosening. But there was no time to wonder how, no time to question the light that flowed from her like a river. She could barely think, barely feel beyond the overwhelming pulse of energy, the roar in her ears. "Ava, come on," Liam cried, pulling her once more. This time, she moved without hesitation, running with him, her feet carrying her forward without thought, her body powered by some force she couldn't comprehend. They pushed through the clearing, past the trees, past the breaking dark, until the woods began to thin, the shadows finally receding behind them. The moment they crossed into the open air, the weight lifted from Ava's chest, and a light flickered out. The forest was silent. For a moment, Ava could only stand there, gasping for air, feeling the cold sweat on her skin as the last remnants of the terror began to fade. The others were behind her, Maya, Elliot, Jasper, panting, wide-eyed, but they were all alive. They were all safe. "Ava," Liam's voice was soft, almost reverent. "What was that? What happened?" Ava shook her head, her breath still coming in short bursts. "I don't know." Her voice trembled. "But I think we're not finished. It's still out there. It's not gone." Liam's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Ava swallowed hard, her eyes searching the edge of the woods. "I can feel it. It's still waiting. It wants me. It wants us all." And deep down, Ava knew something else. The darkness wasn't just in the woods. It was inside her now, too. The words hung in the air like an unbearable weight. Ava could feel the pulse of dread creeping through her veins, settling into her bones. She was shaken, the remnants of terror still clinging to her. But something deeper inside her was beginning to stir, an unsettling awareness that she had only seen the tip of whatever nightmare the forest had unleashed. Liam's hand was still gripping her arm, his fingers tight, but his touch was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. "Ava, don't say that," he said, his voice low and fearful, but tinged with disbelief. "We made it out. We're safe now." "No, Liam." Ava turned to face him, her eyes wide with a growing sense of unease. "We're not safe. It's like it followed us. Whatever that thing was, it's not done with us." Maya's voice cut through the silence, fragile but determined. "But we're out of the woods now. We've left it behind, haven't we?" Ava looked over at Maya, her friend's face pale, eyes still wide with fear. Ava could see the doubt in her eyes, the desperate hope that maybe they had escaped, that the terror had ended. But it hadn't. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the lingering darkness. She could still feel the weight of it pressing in on her chest. The thing in the woods wasn't just some creature. It was something older, something more ancient than anything they could imagine. And it had marked them. It had marked her. "There's something wrong with the world now," Ava murmured, barely above a whisper. "Something different." Liam's grip tightened on her, his voice rising with urgency. "Stop, please. Let's just get out of here. We'll get back to the car, to safety." But Ava couldn't shake the feeling, that deep, gnawing sense of wrongness in the pit of her stomach. The world felt off-kilter now, like the ground beneath her was no longer solid. She felt as if she were walking in someone else's dream, or worse, someone else's nightmare. "We need to go back," Ava said, her voice harder now, tinged with a cold resolve that none of them could ignore. The others froze, their gazes locked onto her, uncertain of what she meant. Back to the forest? After everything they'd just been through? "Ava, are you serious?" Maya's voice was a mix of disbelief and concern, her brows furrowed in confusion. "You want us to go back in there?" Ava nodded, her eyes darkening with something she couldn't explain. "We have to stop it. Whatever it is, it's not done with us. If we leave now, it's just going to follow us. And next time, we might not survive." There was a long pause, the group exchanging uneasy glances. Elliot looked like he was about to protest, but something in Ava's eyes stopped him. He took a deep breath, his face pale but resolute. "We don't know what's out there," he said, his voice rough. "But I don't think you're wrong." "Yeah." Maya's voice cracked slightly. "It's like it wants us to come back. It's waiting." The fear in her voice wasn't something Ava had expected to hear, but it confirmed what she already knew. The darkness wasn't just in the forest. It was alive, somehow. It knew them. It was waiting for them to come back, to finish what it had started. Liam's hand dropped from Ava's arm, and he stepped back, his face pale and strained. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I can't go back there. I almost lost you, Ava. I can't." Ava turned to face him, the pain in her chest worsening. "I'm not asking you to come with me, Liam. I'm just saying we have to go back. If we don't, if we leave it to fester, we're all doomed." Liam's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked like he might collapse from the weight of it all. But then, slowly, his gaze met hers, tired, resigned, but understanding. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't just run. Not this time." For a moment, Ava didn't know if she was relieved or more terrified. They were all standing there at the edge of the forest, with nothing but the weight of their decision pressing down on them. It felt like a point of no return. They had already crossed the line, and now they had to go back, deeper into the heart of the nightmare, to confront whatever evil had been awakened. Jasper, who had been silent this whole time, spoke up suddenly. His voice was steady, but there was a hardness to it that hadn't been there before. "We do this together. If it kills us, it kills us. But I'm not letting it pick us off one by one. Not while we still have a chance." Ava looked at each of them in turn. Maya, her face pale but determined. Liam, still trembling but resolute. Elliot, who was visibly trying to steady his nerves. They were scared terrified, but they were willing to stand with her. And that was all Ava needed. They began moving again, this time walking in the direction of the forest. The once comforting sound of the wind rustling through the trees now sounded like a warning. The shadows pressed in around them, and the world felt too quiet. The moon overhead was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air grew colder, heavier. As they stepped back into the woods, Ava's heart rate quickened. It was like the forest itself was watching them, waiting as if it knew they were coming. They walked for what felt like hours, the trees closing in on them, their twisted forms casting eerie, contorted shadows. Every step felt as though they were being pulled deeper into the darkness, the silence growing more oppressive with every passing minute. And then, suddenly there it was, the clearing. The very spot where everything had started, but wasn't the same as before. The ground was cracked, as though something had torn through it. The trees were warped, their bark blackened and twisted. The air smelled like rot. The figure, that terrifying man with the glowing eyes, was gone, but something else was there. A shape, a presence. It hovered in the center of the clearing, massive and shifting, like it was made of shadows, but it was alive. It was the forest, but twisted, a grotesque mockery of the natural world. The air hummed with energy, dark and cold. Ava stepped forward, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's here," she whispered, "and it's ready." The others stood behind her, afraid, but not turning back. The darkness called to them, and they had no choice but to face it head on. The time for running was over. Now they had to fight. Ava stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in shallow, erratic gasps as the cold weight of the presence pressed in on her. Her eyes flickered over the twisted shapes of the trees, the warped earth, and the unsettling hum that vibrated through the air like a living thing. It was as though the forest had shifted, like it was now an entirely different realm, a dark reflection of the place it used to be. Behind her, she could hear the others, their footsteps hesitant, their breathing uneven, but no one spoke. The air was too thick with tension, too charged with the electric pulse of something ancient, something powerful, watching them from the shadows. "It's alive," Maya whispered, her voice strained. Her wide eyes were fixed on the shape at the center of the clearing, something that flickered and twisted, as if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. It was vast, constantly shifting in and out of shape, its presence both everywhere and nowhere at once. Ava could feel it gnawing at her, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. "It's not just a thing," Ava said, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It's the forest, twisted, like it's alive," Maya muttered, her voice trembling. Liam stepped up beside Ava, his hand brushing against hers. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else too, a sense of determination. "Whatever it is, we have to stop it." Ava nodded, but her mind raced with uncertainty. They were so close now. Too close. It was almost as if the entity had been waiting for them, patiently, silently, biding its time. Ava could feel the weight of it pressing in around her, like the forest itself was closing in, boxing them in. The trees seemed to lean toward them, their gnarled, twisted branches hanging low, their bark blackened and scarred. The shadows writhed and swirled, creating figures that didn't quite make sense, shapes that might have been human, but were stretched and warped beyond recognition. "Ava, look!" Elliot's voice broke through her thoughts, his gaze locked on the dark mass at the center of the clearing. There, amidst the shifting shadows, something was beginning to take shape. A figure, tall, almost too tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Its head was a mass of shadows, an absence where a face should have been. The figure moved. The ground trembled beneath them. Ava's heart slammed into her ribs. It was coming toward them. Liam took a step back, his face pale, but he didn't say a word. He was shaking, but he stood his ground. Maya's hand shot out to grab onto his arm, her grip tight with fear. "I told you," Ava said, her voice barely audible. It's here to take us. It's waiting. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate. It didn't hurry toward them. It was like it was savoring the moment. The ground beneath its feet cracked, the earth seeming to shift and pulse as it advanced, as if the very earth itself was bowing to its will. "Why are you here?" Maya whispered, her voice strained. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The shadows writhed and flickered around it, and Ava could feel the answer, cold and suffocating, pressing in on her chest. It doesn't want to let go. The air crackled with an energy that felt wrong, oppressive, and suffocating. Ava took a step forward, as if drawn by some unseen force. She could feel the dark power tugging at her chest, pulling her in like a magnet, urging her closer to the figure. "No," Liam said, his voice hoarse, his hand catching her wrist. "Ava, stop. Don't go toward it." But Ava didn't hear him. She didn't hear anything except the dark hum in the air, the whispers, the pull. Her mind felt foggy, like a distant echo, but the pull was real. She had to stop it. She had to end it. Before she could take another step, she felt a sharp, ice-cold grip on her arm. It wasn't Liam's hand this time. It was something colder, something far more powerful. The fingers that wrapped around her were thin, too thin, like bone and shadow. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she whipped around to see the source of the touch. It wasn't just the figure that had reached out. From the shadows between the trees, there were more of them. Shadows that weren't moving like natural creatures. No, they slithered, their forms distorted and grotesque. Their eyes were like burning pits of darkness, and their mouths stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. They were closing in. "No!" Ava gasped, the word barely leaving her lips before the creatures surged forward, their cold hands reaching for her. But in that moment, everything stopped. The ground rumbled, and Ava's vision blurred with a bright flash of light. It was as if the world itself was breaking apart. The shadow figure in the center of the clearing froze. Its body trembled, its shape beginning to distort, as if it were caught in some kind of violent rift. Ava could feel the power in the air, raw, unstable, chaotic. And then it spoke. Not in words. No, the figure didn't need words. The voice that filled her mind was so deep, so ancient, it was like a roar from the very core of the earth. "You should not have come here." Ava staggered back, her mind reeling from the force of the thought. The voice wasn't just heard. It was felt, vibrating through her entire body, sending a chill through her bones. It was everywhere, an all-encompassing presence that surrounded her, filled her, suffocated her. The creatures stopped, their bodies frozen in place, their glowing eyes dimming. But Ava's feet didn't stop. She took another step back, and another, until her body collided with something solid. Liam was there, his hand on her shoulder, pulling her back toward the others. "Ava, we need to move. It's not too late to leave." But Ava didn't respond. Her mind was spinning, her body numb, but her thoughts were clear now. This wasn't just a creature they were facing. This was something beyond comprehension. Something that didn't just want to consume them. It wanted to erase them from existence, to unmake them. And they weren't getting out of this without a fight. "We need to destroy it," Ava said, her voice raw but steady. "It's the only way." The group exchanged uncertain looks, but there was no time for doubt. It was too late to run. They would have to face whatever the forest had unleashed head-on. Ava's words hung in the air like a final warning, and the weight of them seemed to settle heavily on the group. For a moment, no one spoke, their minds racing, their hearts thumping loudly in their chests. The shadows in the clearing seemed to pulse, growing heavier, more oppressive, as though they were alive and watching them. Liam's hand tightened on Ava's shoulder, a silent reassurance, but there was no denying the fear in his eyes. How? How are we supposed to destroy something like that? Ava didn't know. She didn't have the answers. But deep down, she felt a fierce, desperate certainty. They had no choice but to try. "We find it's hard," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Every evil has a source, a core. If we can find that, maybe we can stop it. Maya's breath hitched, her voice barely a whisper. How do we even begin to find its heart? It's not like anything we've seen. But Ava had already started moving, her feet carrying her toward the center of the clearing, where the shadowed figure stood, its form twisting and undulating, like it was trying to hold its shape in the face of something powerful. The others hesitated but followed, their movements slow, almost reluctant, as if every step was being dragged out of them by some invisible force. Ava's eyes scanned the clearing. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong. The earth here wasn't solid. It shifted with every step, like it was breathing, like it was alive. The trees surrounding them groaned and creaked, their twisted limbs reaching out, as if trying to grab hold of them, to pull them into the shadows. But Ava couldn't stop. The pull to move forward was stronger than anything she'd felt before. The power in the air, thick and electric, seemed to be pushing her, urging her to come closer. And then she saw it. The center of the clearing, where the dark mass of the shadowed figure twisted in on itself, was hollow. There was an opening there like a mouth or a wound, dark and jagged. Inside, she could see something shifting, something pulsing with a dark, unnatural light. Her heart skipped in her chest. It was there. It was the core. Ava turned back to the others. It's there. We need to get inside it. No. Liam's voice was a desperate cry. Ava, you can't. It'll. But Ava wasn't listening. She knew what she had to do, what they had to do. The darkness wasn't going to give them a choice. It would consume them all if they didn't act. They couldn't afford to hesitate. With a deep breath, she pushed forward. As she crossed the threshold of the hollow space, the air seemed to change. The humming energy in the air grew sharper, colder. It felt like she was stepping into the heart of something vast and ancient, a place where time didn't exist. The shadows in the center were alive. They were swirling, pulling together into a form, a dark, shapeless mass that seemed to pulse with every breath Ava took. It was like a storm, dark and consuming, but at its heart, there was something solid, something powerful, pulsing with malevolent force. The others followed, but Ava could hear their footsteps growing heavier, more reluctant. Even Elliot, who had been the most determined among them, seemed to be faltering. But Ava didn't stop. She couldn't. As they drew closer, the shadows seemed to respond, the air thickening, swirling around them like tendrils reaching out. Ava's skin crawled, her hair standing on end as she felt the cold fingers of the darkness brushing against her, testing her, pulling at her. Liam's voice trembled behind her. Ava, stop. This is insane. But Ava didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. She had to finish this. They had to end it. The dark mass ahead of them was alive now, writhing, the shadows pulsating as if it were breathing. Ava could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a cold, unnatural force that seemed to pull at her very soul. It was like nothing she had ever felt before. The very air here seemed to thrum with power, a power that was too ancient, too vast, and too hungry. And then, the shadows parted. A single, towering figure emerged from the mass. Its shape was more defined now, a silhouette of twisted limbs, a face that flickered in and out of existence, like a nightmare of made flesh. Its eyes were glowing pools of black fire, and the moment it locked eyes with Ava, a chill of terror shot through her. The voice filled her mind again, louder, more forceful than before. You should not have come here. You cannot fight me. You will be swallowed by the darkness. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't just coming from the figure anymore. It was everywhere. It was in her thoughts, in her veins, like the pulse of some ancient god, a voice too powerful to ignore. But Ava refused to back down. She felt the pulse of something deep inside her, something she hadn't known was there. She had already come too far. There was no turning back. Not today, she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. The figure loomed over them, its form darkening the air around them. Ava could feel the others' fear, Maya's trembling hands, Liam's shallow breath, Elliot's clenched fists, but they were all here, standing with her against this thing. And then the figure spoke again, this time directly to her, its voice a cruel, mocking whisper. "You think you could defeat me? You are nothing. You are already mine. You were always mine." The words slammed into Ava's mind, trying to break her, to make her doubt. But she couldn't. She wasn't alone. With a sudden surge, the darkness around them seemed to shudder. The shadows flickered, and for a brief moment, a flash of light cut through the suffocating dark. It was as if something deep inside her had awoken, a power, a fire that had been there all along. The energy that had surged through her before was back, stronger, fiercer. She raised her hand, her heart pounding in her chest, and a blinding light erupted from her palm, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The figure screeched, the sound rattling the very ground beneath them. The dark mass around it twisted and wailed, but the light grew brighter, stronger, as if the forest itself was rebelling against the darkness. Ava pushed forward, her hand trembling but steady. The power inside her built, growing stronger, until she could feel it surging through every fiber of her being. And with a final cry, she released it. The clearing exploded with light. The shadows howled, retreating from the brilliance, cracking and splintering like glass. The figure screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound that tore through the air, its form disintegrating as the light tore it apart, piece by piece. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, the energy shaking the very earth. Ava fell to her knees, her body exhausted, but she held on, her eyes locked on the spot where the figure had once stood. The light slowly dimmed, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. But the silence was not peaceful. The clearing was empty. The shadows were gone. But Ava knew it wasn't over. She could still feel it. Deep inside her, the forest, the darkness. It was waiting. The silence in the clearing stretched, suffocating in its intensity. Ava's heart was still pounding, the remnants of the power she'd unleashed buzzing in her veins. The others stood around her, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, as if they too could feel the weight of the air pressing in on them. Liam knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder but not quite touching. "Ava, did we do it?" His voice was weak, as though speaking too loudly would somehow disrupt the fragile peace. Ava didn't answer at first. She just stared at the spot where the figure had been, the echoes of its terrifying presence still rippling through the air. The clearing seemed empty, but it wasn't peaceful. The earth beneath them felt unsettled, shifting, alive in a way that was wrong. "No," she whispered finally. "I think. We only stopped it. It's not gone." Maya stepped forward, her eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean? We destroyed it, didn't we? We saw it gone, broken, burned away. That thing is gone." Ava shook her head slowly, her breath still coming in quick bursts. Her body ached with exhaustion, but there was a gnawing feeling deep in her chest that wouldn't let her rest. The energy in the air, the pulse of the forest, it had been so close, just a heartbeat away from being consumed entirely. But now, it was like something had shifted. Something else was lurking in the dark corners of her mind, as if the very forest had absorbed part of that darkness, wearing it like a cloak. "It didn't want to be destroyed," Ava murmured, her voice distant, almost as if she wasn't entirely present. "It just adapted. It's in the forest. It's in us." Liam looked at her, eyes filled with concern. "Ava, stop. You're just..." "No," she interrupted, lifting her gaze to meet his, her eyes sharp with clarity. "I'm not just imagining things. It's inside me, inside all of us. It changed us." Elliot, who had been standing by silently, now spoke, his voice rough. "What do you mean, inside us?" Ava paused, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, where she could still feel the faintest pulse of something other than her own heartbeat. It was like a whisper in the back of her mind, just below the surface, and she could feel its hunger. The shadow, the forest, the darkness. "I can feel it," she said quietly. "It's waiting." The ground beneath their feet trembled, just for a second, as if in response to her words. The group collectively froze, their eyes darting nervously around the clearing. The trees, which had once felt like a twisted maze, now seemed to be moving slowly, subtly, as if the very forest itself were watching them, waiting. "We need to get out of here," Liam said quickly, grabbing Ava's arm and pulling her to her feet. His touch was warm, grounding her, but it didn't erase the cold dread that had settled deep in her gut. "We need to leave now." But Ava didn't move. She couldn't. There was something compelling her to stay, a force that had burrowed deep inside her, spreading its tendrils through her mind. It was like a call, a whisper, one that promised answers, promised an end. She could feel its power, the forest's power, stronger now, darker than before. "I can't," she murmured, her voice distant, her eyes unfocused. "It's here. It won't let us leave." Maya grabbed her by the shoulders, her voice urgent. "Ava, don't listen to it. Whatever it is, we need to get out of here before it pulls us under completely." But Ava couldn't hear her. Not completely. The pull from the forest was too strong now, like the very trees around them were reaching out to her, calling her to join them in the darkness. "They will come for you. All of you." The voice was louder now, cutting through her thoughts like a knife. She could almost hear it whispering through the leaves, the branches, the very earth beneath her feet. It was the forest's voice, or whatever remained of the creature's presence in this place, and it wasn't just in her mind. It was alive now, wrapped around the roots, feeding off the remnants of its ancient darkness. "We have to go," Liam urged, his voice becoming more desperate. "Ava, please. You're not yourself. This place is doing something to you." But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, the trees growing darker in the distance. There was something in the distance, something shifting among the leaves. At first, she thought it was just the wind, until she saw the movement again. Figures. Shadows. Flickering forms that didn't belong. "They're coming," she whispered. They never left. The figures came into focus then, emerging from the edges of the forest, their shapes distorted, flickering in and out of existence like the very air was bending around them. Their eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, their limbs too long, too thin, their movements jerky, unnatural. Ava couldn't move, couldn't speak, but she felt the presence of them all around her, crawling from the corners of her mind. There was no escape. "They were always here," she said again, her voice distant. The forest didn't just bring the darkness. It became it. Liam tried to pull her back, but it was too late. The figures, shadows now, were closing in, their steps echoing like whispers on the wind. The forest seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if it was swallowing them whole. And then, just as Ava thought she could no longer bear the weight of it all, the world went still. The forest froze, the air went silent, as though time itself had stopped. And in that silence, she understood. The forest, the creature, they were one. The heart of the forest was the heart of the darkness. It wasn't a separate thing. It had never been. Ava turned, her eyes burning with that final, terrible realization. She wasn't just facing the forest. She was becoming it. The realization hit Ava with the weight of 1,000 truths, each one sharper than the last. The shadowy figures surrounding them weren't just twisted remnants of the creature. They were extensions of the forest itself, the embodiment of its malevolent heart. It wasn't just the creature that had to be destroyed. It was the forest. The ground trembled again, but this time it felt different. It was as if the earth was alive, pulling them deeper into its roots. Ava's body screamed for her to run, to flee, but the forest wouldn't let her. It was as though she were bound to it now, connected by an invisible thread that grew tighter with every breath she took. "Ava," Liam shouted, his voice filled with panic. "You're not thinking straight. We can't fight this." We have to go now. But Ava couldn't move. She could feel it, the darkness, the pulse of the forest itself coursing through her veins, clawing at her insides. The figures, the shadows, they weren't just creatures, they were memories, pieces of the forest's ancient history, all of them coiling around her, whispering promises of destruction and rebirth. The voices in her head were louder now, speaking in unison, their words a chorus of distorted anguish. You cannot escape us. You cannot fight us. We are the forest. We are forever. Ava staggered back, clutching her head in agony as the words cut into her thoughts like jagged knives. She felt herself slipping, losing herself to the forest's will, its insidious pull, and she couldn't breathe. The air around her was thick and suffocating, every breath an effort. Fight it, Ava. Maya's voice broke through the haze, a lifeline, a desperate plea. We're still here. We're still us. Don't let it take you. Ava's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, she could hear the others, see them. They were still there, still human, still her friends. And yet, there was an undeniable feeling creeping into her, one of inevitability. The darkness wasn't just in the forest. It was in her too. She could feel it wrapped around her heart, twisting her thoughts, distorting her perception. I can't, Ava gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She felt herself slipping again, the pull of the forest growing stronger, more insistent. It wanted her, needed her. She could feel it in the very marrow of her bones. No! Liam's voice was desperate, pleading. He grabbed her arms, shaking her, trying to bring her back. But Ava barely felt his touch. Her body was becoming numb, her limbs disconnected from her mind, as though they belonged to something else. The forest had her. It had already taken her. And then, in the distance, she saw them. The shadows, the figures from the edges of the trees, were closing in, faster now, more tangible, more solid. They weren't just reflections of the forest. They were its guardians, its servants, its creatures born from the ancient darkness that had festered for centuries. They were reaching for her, their hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. The whispers grew louder, louder still. We are one. Ava's body trembled. She was no longer sure where she ended and the forest began. She could feel its ancient will inside her, the way it twisted and broke through the fabric of her humanity. Her heartbeat was no longer her own, the pulse now matching the rhythm of the trees, of the ground beneath her feet. It was all part of it, all part of the same twisted, living thing. Suddenly, something cold brushed against her wrist. Liam. Her hand shot out, her fingers tightening around his, a desperate, instinctual grasp. His grip tightened in return, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ava felt something human, something tethered to the world outside the dark forces pulling at her. Ava, Liam's voice was raw, and she could hear the panic in it. You have to fight it. Don't let it win. But her vision blurred, her body shaking, and she could feel the forest's tendrils wrapping tighter around her, suffocating her, dragging her into its grip. No, she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips, like a confession. I can't. And then something happened. As if on instinct, Liam pulled her close, his voice now sharp with something else, something deeper than panic, something desperate and fierce. You can. You have to. In the split second before Ava could process his words, he did something she hadn't expected. He pressed his palm flat against her chest, over her heart. The force of his touch was startling, and the moment his skin made contact with hers, she felt a shock of energy surge through her. It wasn't like the darkness. It wasn't oppressive or cold. It was warm, alive, and for the briefest of moments, it pushed back against the pressure in her chest, against the darkness that had been clawing its way into her soul. But then, the forest seemed to respond. It shuddered, its roots creaking and groaning beneath the weight of the confrontation. The shadows flared, and Ava felt a sickening pull, as if the forest was trying to rip her apart, to tear her between Liam's warmth and the cold. inescapable dark. The voices echoed again, this time more frantic. Let her go. Let her be ours. She belongs to us. Ava's body spasmed. The darkness pressed in around her, suffocating her from all sides, but Liam's touch remained. His grip never wavered, even as the pressure around her chest grew unbearable. He wouldn't let her go. He couldn't. And then, just as she felt herself teetering on the edge of complete surrender to the dark, something else inside her snapped. She couldn't say why. She couldn't explain how. But something in her, the last vestiges of her true self, fought back. The forest grip loosened for just an instant, and in that instant, Ava did the only thing she could. She turned her head, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she screamed. The sound was raw, inhuman, as though she were releasing every inch of terror and anger she had ever felt into the world. The scream cut through the air like a blade, slicing through the suffocating shadows that had threatened to consume her. And the forest screamed with her. It was a terrible, agonizing noise, a shriek of fury that tore through the trees, shaking the earth itself. The ground trembled violently, as if the forest was being torn apart at its roots. The figures around them screamed too, their forms flickering and disintegrating, their presence unraveling before their eyes. The darkness recoiled, and for the briefest of moments, Ava felt free. The pressure in her chest lifted, the shadows disintegrating into smoke, evaporating into the air. She collapsed into Liam's arms, her body limp, exhausted, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But even as the forest around them began to quiet, the tremors of the earth slowing, Ava couldn't shake the feeling. The forest was not done with them. It was the forest, and no matter what they had just done, the dark heart of it still lingered. She could still hear its whispers echoing in the back of her mind. You cannot escape us. Ava's chest heaved with shallow breaths, her pulse racing as she collapsed into Liam's arms. The world around her was still. The forest, once alive with a deafening presence, had quieted, but it didn't feel safe. No, the air still hummed with a kind of tension, as if the forest was merely biding its time. It was far from defeated. Liam held her tightly, his hand gently stroking her hair. Ava, we did it. But Ava's eyes snapped open, her pupils dilated with panic. No, we haven't. It's not over. Liam stiffened, pulling back slightly to look at her. What are you talking about? The shadows are gone. We destroyed it. But Ava shook her head slowly. We didn't destroy it. We just stopped it. It's waiting. It's still inside us. Maya, who had been standing a few paces behind them, joined the group. What are you saying, Ava? You're scaring me. The forest. It's quiet. We can leave. We need to leave. Right now. Ava glanced up at Maya, her face pale, her body trembling from the exertion, but there was an edge of fear in her eyes. You don't understand. We've only scratched the surface. It's been here the whole time. The forest. The darkness. It's always been part of it. Elliot, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. What do you mean? You're saying the creature we saw wasn't the real enemy? Ava's eyes flickered toward the twisted trees that surrounded them, their gnarled branches stretching high into the sky. There was something unnerving about the way the branches seemed to bend in toward them, as if the trees themselves were closing in. No, she whispered. The creature was only the manifestation of it, the part that was alive. But it's more than just the creature. The forest is. It's the heart of something much older, something we can't even begin to understand. It's been here for centuries, maybe even longer. The shadows, the darkness, it feeds off the land. It feeds off fear, off souls, off the living. And it's not gone. It never will be. A moment of silence passed between them, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The forest around them felt wrong, like something was lurking just out of reach, watching, waiting for the right moment. I'm not crazy, Ava continued, her voice trembling but firm. This is what I've been sensing since we got here. I felt it. It's not just a creature. The whole forest is a trap, an ancient one. It feeds on whatever it touches, and it won't stop until it has every one of us. Liam's grip tightened on her shoulders. Ava, stop. You're not thinking clearly. But Ava could see it. The shadows had receded for now, but they hadn't disappeared. The very ground beneath them felt like it was pulsing with a low hum, as though the forest itself was alive in a way they couldn't even comprehend. And then a sudden, cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a bitter smell of decay, of something ancient and festering. No, Ava whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to the others, her eyes wide with realization. It's coming. At first, they couldn't see it. They didn't notice the subtle shifting in the trees, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and flicker. But Ava could feel it. The forest had changed. The quiet wasn't peace, it was a lull before the storm. And then they heard it. A low, guttural sound from somewhere deep within the woods. The wind picked up, howling now, the branches of the trees creaking and groaning as if they were alive. A single, chilling scream echoed from the distance, one that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The creatures, the figures they'd seen before, were emerging from the shadows once more. Only now, they weren't flickering. They were solid, moving with a terrible, purposeful speed. Toward them. Each one of them had the same haunting, empty eyes, the same grotesque shapes, their limbs too long, their features twisted beyond recognition. And this time, there were more of them. There. Real, Maya stammered, her voice small, shaken by the sight of the figures approaching them. They're not shadows. They're here. Ava's heart raced in her chest as she watched them move forward, each of the figures stretching their long, unnatural limbs, twisting and jerking as they neared. Their hollow eyes bored into her soul, and the whispers, that whispering voice, grew louder, more frantic. Come closer. Join us. The darkness calls. The world around them seemed to bend, the air thickening with every step they took. The ground beneath them shook again, and this time wasn't just the earth, it was the very forest moving. The trees creaked and groaned, bending toward them as if they were being drawn in by some invisible force, preparing to swallow them whole. Ava took a step back, fear clawing at her insides, but her feet felt frozen. It was as though the forest itself was keeping them here, anchoring them in place. I told you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. It's not over. It's never over. Liam pulled her closer, trying to keep her grounded. We need to get out of here, he said, urgency in his voice. Now, we're not fighting this thing. We can't. We need to run. But Ava didn't hear him. The forest was already closing in, its tendrils reaching out to snare them. There was no escape. She could feel it now, the weight of the forest grip on her mind, on her soul. And then, out of nowhere, a dark figure appeared in the distance, much larger than the others, its shape monstrous and imposing, with eyes that gleamed like burning embers. This one was different. It wasn't like the shadows that had surrounded them. This one was real. This one had form, and it was watching them. Ava's body froze in terror. That voice, the one that had been inside her mind all along. It spoke now, clearer than ever before. You cannot escape. You're a part of the forest now. The darkness is inside you, and it will consume you. Forever. Her eyes widened. Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel it inside her. The forest. The darkness. It was waiting to pull her in, waiting to claim them all. And just like that, Ava knew. The forest wasn't going to stop. The battle they had fought, the one they had thought they'd won, had only been the beginning. The true fight was only starting. The air in the clearing was thick with dread, every breath like inhaling the very essence of the darkness that was slowly consuming them. The wind howled, swirling around them like a banshee's wail, the trees creaking and groaning as if they were alive. Ava could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, wrapping around her like an oppressive blanket, smothering every ounce of hope she had left. The massive figure that emerged from the shadows seemed to be the focal point of it all. It loomed like a monstrous sentinel, its body a twisted amalgamation of branches, bark, and something far darker. Its eyes were pools of molten red, burning with a feral hunger, and its massive form moved with an unnatural grace, the very air around it warping as it stepped closer. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, and her legs trembled beneath her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The forest was closing in on them, trapping them in its grasp. The shadows had already surrounded them, figures emerging from the trees like twisted, broken versions of themselves. Liam was holding on to her, his grip firm but desperate. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he was still fighting to hold on to something, some shred of the reality they once knew. "We need to get out of here," Liam repeated, his voice frantic. "We need to find a way out." But Ava knew. There was no way out. Not anymore. Not from this. "They're the forest," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "The shadows, the figures, they're not separate from it. They are it, and we're part of it now, too." Liam's grip tightened, and his expression faltered. No, you're not like them. We're not like them. You're still you, Ava. Please, we have to leave before it's too late." But the words sounded hollow to Ava. She had known, deep down, that leaving wasn't an option. The forest had already rooted itself in her soul. The darkness had been inside her from the beginning, feeding on her fear, her doubt, her very being. The creature, the forest, was no longer something they could fight. It was part of them now. Ava's mind reeled, but she could feel something else now. A voice. One that wasn't her own, but still echoing in her mind, beneath her thoughts. It was cold and ancient, wrapped in layers of whispering darkness. "You cannot escape." The words sent a chill down her spine. The forest wasn't just speaking to her. It was speaking to all of them through her. It had chosen her as a vessel, as its messenger, and she could feel it stirring inside her, its hunger, its rage. Liam shook her gently, trying to snap her out of her trance. "Ava, please don't listen to it. We can still fight. We can still find a way." But it was already too late. The towering figure in front of them reached out a long, gnarled arm, its fingers stretching like branches, curving toward them with an unsettling, deliberate motion. Its eyes locked onto Ava's, and she felt her body freeze, her heart skipping a beat. The moment those eyes met hers, she could feel the forest filling her, suffocating her mind, her thoughts, until there was nothing but the crushing weight of its presence. "You are ours now." The voice echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. The darkness that had been a murmur at the back of her consciousness was now a roaring, deafening storm, drowning out everything else. Ava felt herself stepping forward. Her body moved against her will, drawn to the creature, to the forest. She tried to fight it, tried to tear herself away, but her limbs felt heavy, her thoughts blurred, like they were being swallowed whole by the very ground beneath her. Liam reached for her again, his hand desperate. "Ava, no!" But the forest's grip was too strong. It was inside her now. And it wasn't just the forest, it was the creature too, the twisted heart of everything, pulling her closer. Her chest tightened, and for the first time, Ava felt it, the forest's heartbeat. It was slow and steady, but suffocating, like a death knell echoing through the very trees. She could feel it pumping through her, drowning out the last vestiges of her own humanity. "You will become one with us." The words, the force, it was all-encompassing. Ava could feel herself fading, disappearing into the darkness, becoming part of the very thing she had tried to escape. But then something unexpected happened. Liam stepped forward, pushing through the shadows, his voice cutting through the suffocating weight of the forest's power. "Ava, listen to me. You are not just the forest. You are you. You have to fight it. I believe in you." There was a moment of silence. A brief, fragile moment where the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, something inside Ava shifted. For the first time, she could feel her own heartbeat again, steady and true. It was like a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her legs moved of their own accord, stepping back, away from the creature, away from the pull of the forest. She blinked, her vision clearing for the first time in what felt like forever. The whispers in her mind began to quiet, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for her to breathe again. Liam's hand was still outstretched toward her, his eyes filled with urgency and hope. "Ava, please." Ava's chest heaved as she focused on him, focusing on the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his voice. She clung to it, the only thing left in the chaos. But then the forest roared in fury, the ground shaking violently beneath their feet as the trees writhed and twisted like living creatures. The shadows surged forward, a wave of darkness that threatened to engulf them all. Ava's mind raced. She couldn't just run. The darkness was in the land, in the air, in everything. But they had to leave. They had to escape, even if it meant leaving the forest behind. And in that moment, Ava realized something else. The forest would never let them go. It would always be with them, a part of them. The darkness would follow them, in their shadows, in their thoughts. But they could fight it. They could choose to fight. And with that thought, Ava turned toward her friends, her resolve hardening. They weren't going to let the forest win. They were going to find a way to stop it. To end it. Together. The wind howled louder, as if in defiance of their resolve, and the trees around them groaned and cracked, stretching toward them with limbs that seemed to reach like fingers of some ancient, vengeful god. Ava's body was still heavy with the pull of the darkness, but now there was a fire burning inside her, fueled by the will to survive. The forest could try to claim her, they could try to claim her, but Ava wasn't about to give in. Not now. Liam's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to move. Now." His hand was still outstretched, his grip on her strong, but his face was etched with fear. His voice, though desperate, was the tether that held her grounded. The shadows were closing in. Maya, standing to their side, clutched her arms tightly to her chest, her body trembling, but there was a fire in her eyes now too. She was ready to fight, or, at the very least, to run. Elliot, too, had pulled himself together, his face pale but determined. But Ava knew that running wasn't enough. They couldn't outrun this. The forest was everywhere. It would follow them. It would haunt them. "We need to destroy it," Ava said, her voice steady now, despite the terror still coursing through her veins. "We need to destroy the heart of the forest. It's the only way." Liam's expression flickered with confusion. "The heart of the forest? What are you talking about?" "The creature, the one that's controlling everything, it's not just in the forest. It is the forest. It's the core of it. We destroy it, and we can destroy the forest." There was a moment of hesitation, as if the words didn't quite make sense, but Ava could feel it in her bones. The forest wasn't just a place. It was an entity. A living, breathing, and hungry entity. And as much as it was feeding off of them now, it had a core. Everything did. She had to get to the center, the heart of it. Liam, still holding her, seemed to come to some kind of realization. He nodded, his eyes hardening with determination. "Okay, we'll find it. We'll stop it." Maya and Elliot exchanged a quick look, their resolve slowly solidifying the face of what was becoming their last chance for survival. But just as they turned to move, the ground beneath them trembled once again. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she looked around. The darkness, the shadows that had been lingering just at the edges of their vision, were now rising up, coiling around them like snakes, stretching out long, twisting limbs. The figures that had once been flickering in and out of existence were now full, real, and malevolent, closing in on them from all sides. The whispers grew louder, rushing into Ava's ears like a storm. "Come closer. Join us. The darkness calls to you." Ava clenched her fists, shaking her head as the voice grew louder, as if trying to tear her mind apart. The shadows reached for her, but she fought against them, pushing through the horror, through the rising tide of fear and confusion. "Focus," she whispered to herself, even as the shadows scraped against her mind. "We have to get to the heart. We can do this." Liam stepped forward, pulling Ava with him. "We're with you," he said, his voice calm, but it carried an urgency. "Lead the way." With one final glance back, Ava turned toward the forest. The trees loomed over them like giants, but she knew they weren't just trees. They were the extension of something far darker, something far older. And if they were going to survive, they would have to face whatever lay at the heart of it. Ava could feel the pull of the forest deep inside her, tugging at her very soul, but she resisted it. One step at a time. Each step took them deeper, farther into the labyrinth of twisted roots and dark, oppressive air. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to twist around them, the trees contorting in unnatural ways, as if the very ground beneath them was alive with the intention of trapping them forever. It was as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for them to falter. The ground beneath their feet became slick with something dark, something alive. Ava could feel the pulse of the earth beneath them, the rhythm of the forest's heart, beating in time with the shadows closing in on all sides. "It's close," Ava whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "We're getting close." Suddenly, the ground beneath them erupted with a violent tremor, and the trees seemed to howl with the force of a quake. The shadows surged forward, faster now, their forms twisting and warping into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock them with their hollow, soulless eyes. Ava didn't hesitate. She could feel the energy, the pulse of the forest just ahead. The heart was close. She could feel it, its presence like a dark star drawing them in, pulling them toward it. "Come closer." The voice was so loud now, it felt as though it was inside her head, her heart, her very being. She could feel her breath quickening, her pulse racing. It was so hard to fight the temptation to give in, to let go of everything, to succumb to the forest's overwhelming power. But then, in the distance, she saw it. A clearing. In the center of it stood a massive, gnarled tree, its trunk twisted and dark, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural glow. It stood taller than anything else in the forest, its roots sprawling out like veins across the earth, feeding the very land itself. And at the base of the tree, Ava could feel it, the dark, ancient force that had been controlling everything. That was the heart. "That's it," Ava breathed. "That's the heart of the forest." Liam gripped her arm tightly, his voice low and urgent. "Then let's end this." They moved toward the heart, the shadows closing in, but they were relentless now, faster, more tangible. The whispers clawed at their minds, demanding them to stop, to join, to surrender. But Ava pushed through the fear, leading her friends toward the towering tree that pulsed with an energy so dark it made her blood run cold. As they neared the tree, the shadows came for them, reaching out with clawed hands, wrapping around their ankles, their arms, their bodies. Maya screamed as one of the figures grabbed her by the wrist, but Elliot swung his arm around, slashing at it with the sharpest branch he could find. But Ava wasn't looking at them. She was focused on the tree, the source of it all. The heart of the forest was waiting for them. And it wasn't just a tree. It was a gateway, a doorway. Ava stepped closer, knowing that whatever happened next, the battle for their lives would be decided in the heart of this ancient, dark power. The shadows were closing in faster now, like a tidal wave of darkness, swallowing up the ground beneath their feet, their every movement slowed by the unnatural weight of the forest's curse. Ava's pulse raced as she stepped closer to the massive tree, its gnarled trunk pulsing with an eerie, malevolent glow. Each throb seemed to match the rhythm of her own heart, but louder, more demanding. The air grew colder the nearer they got. It was as if the very essence of the forest was alive, breathing with them, sharing its cold, ancient breath with the air around them. Ava could feel it deep in her bones. The forest was watching them, waiting, testing them. The shadows reached for them, their hands like tendrils, grasping at anything they could touch. Maya was struggling, trying to pull away from one of the dark figures that had grabbed her by the wrist. Her face was twisted in fear as she kicked and fought, but the shadow didn't release her. Ava's heart clenched. "No, we have to make it to the tree." "Liam," Ava shouted, her voice barely audible over the growing noise of the shadows, whispering and hissing. "Come closer. Join us. Become one with us." Liam, standing just behind Ava, had already grabbed Maya by the other arm, yanking her toward him, tried to pull her away from the suffocating grasp of the dark figure. "We can't let it take you," Liam growled, his face stricken with panic, but his eyes hardening with determination. He was using all of his strength to pull Maya free. "Fight it, Maya. Come on." Maya's lips parted as she gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror. "I can't, it's too strong. It's everywhere." Ava's eyes flickered to the tree in the center of the clearing. The shadows seemed to be swirling toward it now, as if they were feeding on the tree itself. Ava felt her heart beat faster. She could sense the power, the malice in the air. The tree was alive. It was more than just a tree. It was a conduit for the forest's power. This is it, she thought. The heart of the forest. The source of everything. Ava knew, deep in her gut, that they had no time to waste. She was certain now, if they didn't destroy the heart, the forest would consume them all. It was already feeding on them, one by one, tearing at their minds, breaking their spirits. And the more they resisted, the harder it would fight back. "Ava!" Maya screamed, her voice desperate, pulling Ava's attention back. The dark figure was dragging her closer to the tree now, its long fingers like tendrils of smoke wrapping around her throat. Without thinking, Ava lunged forward, her body moving of its own accord, powered by sheer instinct. She grabbed Maya by the shoulders, yanking her away from the grasp of the shadow, and for a brief moment, the darkness seemed to falter, its hold loosening. Maya gasped, coughing in a breath of air. "Get to the tree," Ava shouted, her voice urgent. "Now, we need to destroy it." Maya, breathless and shaking, nodded as she pushed herself to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows around them surged forward, but Ava felt a surge of adrenaline, a single, clear thought slicing through the terror, the heart. The others followed her as they ran toward the gnarled tree. But the shadows were relentless, clawing at them, trying to drag them back into the forest depths. As Ava ran, she could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, threatening to smother her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You cannot escape. You're a part of the forest now. You belong to us." But Ava wouldn't stop. She couldn't. They reached the base of the tree, and Ava could feel the ground shudder beneath them. The roots spread out like thick, black veins, pulsing with unnatural life, digging deep into the earth. The tree loomed above them, its bark twisted and gnarled, its surface slick with dancing darkness. It was like a wound in the earth, an open door to something ancient and unholy. "Ava, we need to do something," Liam shouted, his voice frantic. "What do we do?" Ava stared at the tree, the power of the heart radiating from it, and in that moment, she knew. The power was there, in the core of the tree, pulsing like a dark heart, feeding on everything the forest had claimed. And they had to destroy it before it destroyed them. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out the small, carved dagger they had found earlier in the ruins. It was ancient, old enough to be covered in a layer of dirt and moss, its blade jagged and worn with age. She had no idea if it would work, but at this point, it felt like their only chance. "This is it," Ava said, her voice steady, though the fear still clawed at her chest. She stepped forward, the shadows hissing louder now, swirling around them like a storm. "We have to destroy the heart." Liam and Elliot stood by her side, and Maya, still shaken but with a fierce determination in her eyes, moved to the other side. together, they circled the base of the tree, the shadows swirling around them, tugging at their limbs, their minds. Ava raised the dagger, her hand shaking but steady. She brought it down toward the base of the tree, aiming for the thickest root she could see, the root that seemed to pulse with the most energy. As the blade made contact, the entire forest seemed to shudder, a terrible, deafening noise tearing through the air. The shadows screamed, a horrible cacophony of tortured voices rising in response. The ground beneath them trembled violently. Ava staggered back as the air thickened with a pressure so intense, it felt like it was suffocating them. The tree's roots recoiled, as though it was alive, fighting back. The shadows surged forward, furious now, lashing out at them with cruel intent. But Ava didn't stop. She gritted her teeth and brought the dagger down again, this time piercing deeper into the root. The force was too much. The forest screamed. The tree's trunk cracked, splitting wide open like an enormous, gaping wound. The shadows, the very fabric of the forest itself, shrieked and howled as they were pulled into the center of the tree, feeding the dark power that had held them all captive. And in that moment, Ava felt the force of the forest collapse. The shadows disappeared in a rush of air, leaving only the eerie silence that followed. The oppressive weight that had held the group in place for so long lifted, and the world seemed to return to a semblance of normality, quiet, empty, still. But Ava knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The heart of the forest had been destroyed, but the forest itself was ancient. It was patient. It would return. But for now, they had won. They had escaped, and they had survived. The air was still, too still, as if the entire forest had taken a collective breath and then held it. Ava stood, panting, her hands still gripping the ancient dagger, her knuckles white from the tension. The gnarled tree at the center of the clearing was splintered, its bark cracked and blackened, leaking dark sap that seemed to writhe as it hit the ground. The heart of the forest, the source of the shadows that had tormented them, was dead, at least for now. But Ava knew the truth. The forest was older than anything they could comprehend, and death for something like it was only temporary. It would heal. The darkness would return. It always did. Ava wiped her brow, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "We did it," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Liam was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as she swayed. "You did it. You saved us." She met his eyes, searching for the comfort in them, but there was something dark behind his gaze, something unsettled. The battle was over, but the war, if it could even be called that, was not. Elliot and Maya, too, stood nearby, their faces pale but determined. They had been through hell, but the look in their eyes was one of survival. They had made it this far, and they were going to make it out of the forest no matter the cost. "Let's get out of here," Maya said, her voice raw, but stronger than Ava had heard it before. "We can't stay here. Not now." Ava nodded, her gaze lingering on the darkened remnants of the tree, its roots still twitching as though alive, feeding on the last remnants of power it could draw from the earth. "I know," she said softly. "Let's go." They turned and began to move toward the edge of the clearing. But as they did, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like the forest wasn't finished with them yet. The wind had started to pick up again, carrying with it the faintest scent of something. Something old. Something alive. Ava glanced over her shoulder, just in time to see the tree's cracked trunk twitch violently, the air around it shimmering with the faintest red glow. A low, guttural sound vibrated through the earth, like a growl that started deep in the ground. The shadows that had once been swirling around them like hungry tendrils had returned, creeping from the corners of the clearing, reforming as if they had never been disturbed. "We need to run," Ava said, her voice tight with panic. But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, faster than they had before, reaching for them with terrifying speed. The air became thick with the stench of decay, and Ava could feel it again, the presence, The force that had once controlled the forest, now twisting its way back into being, even as the tree lay broken. "No!" Ava screamed, her hand outstretched, but the shadows were faster now, moving with intelligence, wrapping around her legs, her arms, trying to drag her back toward the center of the clearing. Liam reached for her, his face filled with desperation. "Ava!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. He was fighting against the shadows, but they were closing in on all sides, suffocating the air, pushing the group into a corner. They were trapped. Ava's mind raced. There was no way they could escape, not like this. The forest, whatever twisted part of it had remained, was not done with them. It had learned. It had adapted. It had been fed, and now it wanted more. "We have to destroy it again," Ava said, gasping for breath, her voice laced with a wild kind of realization. The forest had returned, stronger, angrier, and it would keep coming until they finished what they had started. But this time, it wasn't just a tree. It was the whole forest. Liam looked at her, his eyes filled with fear but determination. "How? How can we destroy it again? The heart is gone." Ava shook her head, trying to shake the panic away. "No, the heart wasn't just in the tree. It was the whole forest, the earth beneath us, the trees around us, the air itself. We need to destroy the very source of it. The forest's will." Maya grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the shadow's reach. "How do we do that?" Ava's thoughts churned, desperate for a solution. The heart wasn't just the tree. The forest was alive, connected by roots and darkness, by fear and despair. But there had to be a way to sever that connection. Then it hit her. The altar, Ava whispered. The ruins they had found earlier, the old stone structure hidden in the forest. She remembered the strange symbols etched into the stone, the feeling of unease that had surged through her when she touched it. The altar had been connected to something ancient, something that had linked the forest to its power. "Remember the ruins?" Ava said urgently. "We need to get back there. It's the only place where we can sever the forest's hold." Liam's face hardened with resolve. "Then we move. Now." But the shadows were closing in, swirling faster, louder. The ground beneath them was shaking, as if the entire forest was coming alive to consume them. Ava didn't wait another second. She grabbed Liam's hand and started running, her heart pounding with every step. She could feel the weight of the shadows closing in behind them, pressing against her like a physical force. They raced through the forest, the trees towering above them, their branches twisting like claws reaching down to grab them. The ground was uneven, the roots catching at their feet, trying to trip them, pull them down. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Ava could hear the whispers now, louder than ever. "You cannot escape. You are ours. Forever." But she was determined. She wouldn't let the forest win. Not after everything they had been through. They reached the ruins, the stone altar standing in the center, just as Ava remembered it. The symbols carved into the stones pulsed with a faint, sickly light, and the air around them was thick with dark energy. "We have to destroy it," Ava said, breathless. "This is the key." Elliot and Maya moved forward, helping Ava and Liam get to the altar. They could feel the oppressive weight of the forest around them, the shadows pulling at them, but they held firm, gathering what strength they had left. Ava stepped forward, her heart racing, and placed her hand on the altar. She could feel it, the ancient power thrumming beneath her fingertips, dark and insidious. But this time, she knew what to do. She whispered the words she had seen in the symbols earlier, the language of the forest, a chant of severance. The moment the final word left her lips, the earth beneath them shuddered. The shadows screamed in fury, the trees howling as they writhed against the spell. But it was too late. The ground cracked open, and the power of the forest, the dark, hungry force, was torn from the land. The shadows writhed and screamed, but slowly they began to dissipate, vanishing into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the forest fell silent, the tension in the air dissipating like a fading storm. Ava collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily, her chest tight with exhaustion. The others were silent, just staring at the altar, as if waiting for the forest to strike back. But it didn't. It was over. For now, the forest had been severed from its heart. The darkness had been destroyed, and they had survived. The silence of the forest was overwhelming. Ava slowly stood, her legs shaking, and glanced around at the others. They were all breathing heavily, their faces pale from the exertion, but there was a quiet relief in their eyes. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of the forest's oppressive presence had finally lifted. The shadows had retreated, and the ancient power that had held the land in its grip seemed to be gone. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, lingering just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting for them to let down their guard. She turned her head sharply, scanning the dark trees surrounding them. No movement, no sound. It was as though the forest itself had taken a moment to recover, to breathe. "We did it," Maya said, her voice unsteady but filled with disbelief. "It's really over?" Ava nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. "It's over. For now. But we can't stay here. The forest may be quiet, but it's not dead." Her eyes flickered to the altar one last time. The stone was still cracked, the faint symbols still glowing, but they no longer pulsed with that malevolent energy. It had been severed. The connection had been broken. Liam looked toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to peek through the trees, casting pale light onto the forest floor. The night had seemed to last forever, but the sun was rising now, and with it came a new sense of urgency. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice firm. "We don't know if it's truly over. The forest might have just retreated. We need to leave before it finds another way to fight back." Ava agreed, and the group began to move. They didn't speak much as they made their way through the forest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path seemed different now, more familiar, less threatening. But Ava couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the forest had marked them, that it wasn't quite done with them. The further they walked, the more the sounds of the forest began to return. Birds, insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it was almost too peaceful, too calm. Ava couldn't understand it. After everything they had just been through, the sudden normality of it all was unnerving. The wind wasn't carrying the stench of decay anymore. The air didn't feel thick with darkness. It was as if the forest had reset itself. "I can't believe we survived," Maya muttered, walking beside Ava, her voice carrying a faint tremor. "I thought we were all going to die in there." Ava glanced at her, offering a small, tired smile. "We almost did," she said quietly, "but we made it out." But Maya's gaze had drifted to the trees around them. "Do you think it will come back? After everything?" Ava hesitated. "I don't know, but I don't think we've seen the last of it." Liam was walking ahead, his shoulders tense. "Ava's right. This forest, it's too old, too strong. We've only broken one connection, but there are more. This wasn't just a tree. This place has a history." The thought of it, the idea that the forest's ancient power could just be waiting to strike again, made Ava's skin crawl. They had seen what it could do. How easily it could pull them into its grasp, twist their minds, break them. And now, with the dawn breaking behind them, she couldn't help but wonder just how far its tendrils stretched. They walked in silence for a while longer, each lost in their thoughts. The forest felt almost like a dream now, too surreal, too quiet. Ava could barely believe it had happened, that they had all come so close to losing everything. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out, that Ava stopped. She turned back, looking over her shoulder at the thick, dark canopy behind them, now just a patch of shadow, fading in the morning light. "Are we going to tell anyone?" Maya asked, her voice hesitant. "About what happened?" "No one would believe us," Elliot replied before Ava could answer, his voice flat. "People would think we're crazy. And even if they did, what good would it do?" Liam added, glancing back at Ava. "The forest is too vast, and it won't forget us. We need to keep this to ourselves." Ava thought about it for a moment. She didn't want to hide the truth, but she knew they couldn't risk anyone else getting caught in the same nightmare. The forest was a dark, ancient thing, and the more people who knew about it, the greater the chance that someone would return, drawn by its power. No one would understand. Ava finally said, her voice steady. "It's best if we keep it to ourselves." Maya nodded reluctantly. "You're right, but still, part of me wishes we could tell someone. Warn people. Do something." Ava reached out and put a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We can't change what happened, but we survived. That's all we can do now." They stood at the edge of the forest for a long time, just staring into the place that had nearly consumed them. There were no words left to say. Everything had already been said in the hours they'd spent fighting for their lives. Finally, they turned away from the woods, making their way toward the town that loomed just a few miles ahead. The further they walked, the more Ava felt the strange weight in her chest lighten. They had survived. They had made it out of the forest. But the nagging thought that had been lingering at the back of her mind never truly left her. The forest was ancient. It wasn't done with them. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Ava felt a chill sweep through her, a whisper of something dark brushing against her consciousness, something that made her stomach churn. And though they were safe for now, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished with them yet. Not by a long shot. As the town came into view, the once familiar streets now felt like a distant memory. Ava's steps were heavy, as though the forest had followed them, its dark presence still clinging to the edges of her mind. The others walked in silence, their expressions tense and distant, like they too were haunted by what they had left behind. The small town was peaceful enough, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. Yet, for Ava, it felt like stepping back into another world, one that was no longer familiar. Her senses were overloaded. Every sound, every whisper of the wind felt like it could be a threat. "We should split up," Liam said, breaking the silence. He looked over at the group, his brow furrowed in thought. "We need some time to process all of this. And I can't shake the feeling that if we stay together too long, it might. Something might happen." Ava nodded slowly. "Yeah, I agree. Let's meet up later. At my place," Maya suggested, looking at each of them. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, but the strength was still there, buried beneath the exhaustion. They all agreed, and soon, they parted ways, each heading in their own direction. Ava didn't feel relief. She didn't feel safe. She felt exposed. The sense that they hadn't truly escaped the forest gnawed at her, like a shadow pressing down on her shoulders. She walked home, her mind replaying every moment in that forest, the dark whispers, the suffocating pull of the shadows, the feeling of something ancient alive, watching them. She couldn't shake the images. She could still feel the heat of the altar beneath her fingertips, the crack of the earth when the connection had been severed. But more than anything, she could still hear the whispers. The faintest echoes at the edge of her thoughts, like voices she couldn't quite catch. She tried to push it away, tried to focus on the mundane task of getting back to her house, but it was impossible. The very air around her seemed wrong. The rustling leaves, the chirping birds. Everything felt too normal. She wanted to scream, to tell someone about the forest, to warn them, but what would they do? Who would believe her? When she reached her house, she was surprised to see her mother's car in the driveway. She hadn't expected her to be back so soon. Her mom's work often kept her late, and Ava had assumed she would be alone tonight. But now, with the strange feelings still clinging to her, she wasn't sure if it was a relief or another complication. Ava opened the door quietly, trying to be as discreet as possible. She didn't want her mom asking too many questions, not yet. Her mind was already in a whirl. She needed to talk to the others first. Her mom's voice called from the kitchen, breaking the silence. "Ava, is that you?" Ava froze. "Yeah, it's me," she called back, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her mom walked into the living room, a bright smile on her face, but the second she saw Ava's expression, her smile faltered. "Are you all right?" her mother asked, stepping closer. eyes scanning Ava with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ava nodded quickly, trying to mask the exhaustion and the fear that was still coursing through her. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Her mom raised an eyebrow, not fully convinced, but not pressing the issue. "You sure? You've been acting a little off lately. You don't look like you've been sleeping well." Ava shrugged. "Just stressed out with school. I'll be fine." Her mom sighed and walked over to the counter, where a pot of tea was cooling. "All right, but if you ever need to talk about anything, you know I'm here, right?" Ava gave her a half-hearted smile, but the words felt hollow. She didn't know how to explain what she had just been through, what she and the others had experienced in the forest. Her mom could never understand. "I'll be fine," Ava repeated, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. Her mom nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to the kitchen to finish making tea. Ava turned away, her heart still pounding in her chest. But as she headed up the stairs to her room, she froze at the top. For a brief second, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, almost a murmur, just below the threshold of hearing. It wasn't in the house. It wasn't her mom. It was outside. Ava's blood ran cold. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, but there was nothing behind her. No one in the hallway. No movement. Only silence. She exhaled shakily and shook her head. The forest had to be playing tricks on her. She had to get some sleep. It had been a long, exhausting ordeal, and her mind was clearly playing catch-up with her body. But as she stepped into her room, she could still feel the weight of it, the presence that had haunted her, the connection she'd felt with the forest, with its ancient, twisted power. She turned to her window, pulling back the curtains, just in time to see something moving in the distance. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the edge of the woods. It was watching her, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel it, them calling to her again. The forest was still there, waiting for her, waiting for them. And in that moment, Ava knew, no matter how far they ran, no matter how far they tried to escape, it would never truly let them go. Ava's heart raced, her breath shallow as she stared at the figure standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was barely visible in the fading light of dusk, but the outline was unmistakable, a silhouette, too still, too unnatural. She blinked, and the figure was gone. The woods were silent, too silent. She let the curtains fall back into place, her hands trembling. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Was it just a trick of the light? Was it the exhaustion from the forest? Or had something followed them back here? She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was more than just a shadow. It had felt like a presence, an energy she couldn't deny, like it had been waiting for her to notice. Ava backed away from the window, slowly, her body stiff. She tried to breathe, to calm herself, but the anxiety gnawed at her insides. The whispers, the strange sensation, were still with her, tugging at her thoughts. She could feel it, like an invisible thread between her and the dark heart of the forest. Her fingers brushed against the pendant her mother had given her years ago, the one she had almost forgotten about. It was small, an intricate silver design of leaves and vines, representing something old, something eternal, something connected to the forest, maybe. The weight of it comforted her for a fleeting second, but only a second. The shadows of the forest stretched farther than she had thought. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to face the possibility that the forest wasn't finished with them. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Something was following them. Something was still out there. A knock on the door startled her. "Ava." Maya's voice came through the wood, quiet but insistent. "It's me. Can we talk?" Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before walking to the door. She opened it to find Maya, standing there, her face pale and tense, eyes flicking nervously to the woods behind her. "Maya," Ava began, her voice strained. "Is everything okay?" Maya stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes darted to the window, to the forest beyond, as if she expected to see something lurking just out of sight. She hesitated, her words hesitant, as if unsure whether she should say what was on her mind. Ava, I don't think we're done. Ava's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Maya swallowed hard, closing the door behind her. I don't think the forest is finished with us. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. I don't think it ever will be. Ava blinked, her thoughts swirling. But we severed the connection. The altar, the tree. Maya shook her head slowly. The forest is still there, still alive. I can feel it, like it's waiting, watching. Ava felt a chill run down her spine. She felt it too. The whispers, Ava murmured, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. I've been hearing them, just like before. Maya's expression faltered, her face filled with a mix of fear and frustration. It's not in our heads, Ava. It's real. It's like the forest has attached itself to us somehow. To me, to you, to all of us. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected it, but hearing Maya say it out loud made the weight of it all feel too real. You think it's still following us? Ava asked, the dread in her voice impossible to hide. Maya nodded, her gaze distant. Yes, and I don't think it's just the forest. I think we woke something else up. Something older. Something worse. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Ava could feel it too, the undeniable sense that they had disturbed something far beyond their understanding. The forest had always been ancient, yes, but now it felt like it had been only a piece of something much larger. What if we didn't destroy it? Ava whispered. What if we touched something deeper in the forest? Something we didn't even realize was there? Maya looked at her, her expression grim. I think we did, and now it's reached out. It's reaching for us, trying to draw us back in. Ava's thoughts swirled, but then a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. It was Liam. Ava, Maya, you guys in there? Ava's heart raced as she opened the door. Liam stood there, his expression tight, eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to jump out at him. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. We need to talk, he said, his voice low, urgent. What's going on? Ava asked. Liam didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a force that made Ava jump. His voice was strained when he spoke again, the weight of something unseen pressing on him. I don't know how to say this, but I've been hearing things in my head while I was walking home from the town center. At first, I thought it was nothing, just me being paranoid. But then, I heard it again. The whispers. Ava's blood ran cold. Liam, don't tell me. No, listen. He raised his hands, cutting her off. It wasn't just the forest. The whispers. They followed me home. They were in my apartment. In my head, like something was trying to get inside. Maya took a step back, face pale. Oh my God. Ava couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. The same whispers that haunted her had now reached Liam. The forest, or whatever dark force it had awakened, was now inside them, tugging at their sanity, clawing at their minds. You think it's trying to possess us? Ava asked, voice trembling. Liam didn't answer immediately, but his eyes were wide with fear. I don't know. I can't stop hearing it. It's like it knows where we are. It's reaching for us. Ava stood frozen for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. They had thought they had destroyed it. They had thought they had severed the forest's power. But now it was clear what they had done hadn't ended anything. It had opened something. Something dark and far older than the forest itself. We need to figure this out, Maya said, her voice shaking but determined. We have to stop it. For good. Ava turned to her, her resolve hardening. Agreed. But we can't do this alone. Liam nodded. We'll have to go back. Find out what really happened, what we missed. Ava shook her head. The idea of going back to that place, to the heart of the darkness, made her stomach twist with dread. But they had no other choice. The whispers were not going away. The forest wasn't going to let them go. And if they didn't find a way to stop it now, they would never be free. The decision was made in silence, a grim understanding hanging heavy in the room. They had to go back. They had to face whatever it was that had awakened deep within the forest. The weight of it pressed down on them, and Ava could feel the suffocating uncertainty in her chest. She was no longer sure if she was terrified of the forest itself or of what had followed them back into the world. Either way, they were being pulled back to a place where reality seemed thin, and their survival was in constant jeopardy. "We should meet at the old bridge tomorrow night," Liam suggested, his voice low. "It's far enough from the town that no one will see us. We'll figure out what we missed in the altar area. Maybe there's something we didn't destroy, something we overlooked." Ava looked at him, her stomach tightening. The thought of returning to that place, the clearing with the altar, the feeling of being watched by ancient eyes, was enough to make her feel physically ill, but there was no other choice. Maya, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, was the first to speak. "I don't like this. I don't like any of this. But if it's the only way..." Ava nodded. "It's the only way." They lingered in Ava's room for a while longer, discussing plans in hushed tones, but the conversation quickly ran dry. Each of them was too wrapped in their own thoughts, the looming darkness of the forest pressing against their minds, demanding attention. Finally, after what felt like hours, they parted ways again, the weight of their shared fear hanging over them. Ava tried to sleep that night, but the whispers never fully left her. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a reminder that they hadn't escaped, that the forest was still there, calling to them. She clutched her pillow tightly, her eyes squeezed shut, trying to drown out the noises in her head, but it was no use. She could feel in her bones the darkness that had taken root, and it was growing stronger with every passing minute. When the sun finally rose, it brought no relief. The day passed in a haze, the hours dragging by, and Ava couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. She went through the motions of a normal day, school, errands, small talk with her mom, but it all felt wrong. The world seemed off, out of sync, as if everything was part of some twisted dream that she couldn't wake from. By the time nightfall approached, the sky was thick with clouds, casting everything in a muted gray. Ava met with Liam and Maya at the old bridge on the outskirts of town, just as the darkness settled in. The air was damp, the trees heavy with moisture, and a faint fog clung to the ground, rolling through the grass in strange, slithering shapes. There was no one around, no headlights from passing cars, no voices echoing through the trees. Just the quiet hum of the night and the whisper of the wind. "You sure this is the place?" Maya asked, her voice sharp with tension as she scanned their surroundings. Liam nodded, his gaze flicking nervously over the horizon. "It's the closest spot to the clearing. If we can't find anything here, we'll head back toward the altar. But we have to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the darkness seemed to cling to the air like a tangible thing. Ava could feel it, the pull, the pressure, the unnatural weight that seemed to press down on her chest. The feeling of being watched. "Let's just get this over with," she whispered, her voice sounding almost foreign in the silence. They walked toward the edge of the forest, toward the dense thicket where the trees grew thick and twisted, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. The fog was heavier now, and it moved in swirling patterns, creeping along the ground as if alive. Ava could almost swear she saw shapes within it, figures, shadows, too quick to fully make out. As they reached the tree line, the air grew colder, and Ava felt the distinct sense of being surrounded. The forest was watching them. The same forest that had tried to claim them just days ago. The forest that seemed so impossibly vast, so ancient, was still here, its presence felt in every rustle of leaves and every whispering breeze. They approached the clearing where they had first encountered the altar, and Ava's stomach clenched with dread. The stone altar was still there, its cracked surface catching the faint light of their flashlights. The symbols that had once glowed with malevolent energy were now dull, faded, as though the forest had pulled back for a moment. retreating just far enough to let them believe they had won. But Ava knew better. "We're missing something," Liam said quietly, crouching down to examine the altar. His flashlight flickered in the dark, casting shadows across the stone. "Look at the cracks. These weren't here before." Ava stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. The cracks in the stone were deeper now, as if something had grown within them. Something dark, something unnatural. The symbols etched into the surface were faint, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. They seemed to shift when she looked away, as though the stone itself was alive, reacting to her presence. Maya's voice cut through the tension, soft but firm. "Do you think it's still here? In the altar?" Ava glanced at her, her throat tight. "I think it's here, but it's not just the altar. It's in us." Liam turned to face her, his expression serious. "What do you mean?" Ava swallowed hard. "The whispers. I've been hearing them. All of us have. It's like we're still connected to it. Maybe when we severed the connection with the altar, we only broke one part of it." Maya stepped forward, her eyes scanning the clearing, the fog swirling around them like it was waiting for something. "So you think the forest has a hold on us? That's why we're hearing things? Because it's connected to us now?" Ava nodded slowly. "I think it's been planting something inside us. It's been waiting, watching, and I don't think we've seen the last of it." Just then, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending a shiver down their spines. The fog parted for a moment, and Ava saw someone standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. A figure, just like the one she had seen the night before. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It was watching them, and it wasn't alone. Ava froze. Her breath caught her throat as she stared at the figure standing just outside the clearing. The faint light of their flashlights barely reached that far, but the figure was unmistakable, tall, thin, and impossibly still, like a shadow carved into the night. Its form was vague, like it was made of the very darkness itself, blending into the fog that surrounded them. It stood at the edge of the clearing, silent and unmoving, but Ava could feel its presence. It was aware of them, watching. "What the hell is that?" Liam whispered, his voice tight with fear, though he tried to keep it steady. "Did anyone else see that?" "I see it," Maya replied, her voice shaking as she reached for the flashlight, her grip unsteady. "It's not just in our heads." Ava swallowed, trying to find her voice, but it was difficult. The whispers, faint but insistent, began to grow louder in her mind, clawing at her thoughts like they were trying to break free. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. "Come closer." "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded, her expression growing more frantic. "I hear it. It's not in my head. It's real." Liam's eyes darted from the figure to the fog, his body tense and ready to bolt. "We need to get out of here. This is insane. We don't know what that thing is, or..." "No!" Ava cut him off, her voice strong, more resolute than she felt. "We can't run. Not anymore. This thing, whatever it is, it's tied to us. We have to face it. We have to break the connection." Liam looked at her, eyes wide, his breath coming out in quick gasps. "Ava, are you serious? We're not ready for this. We don't even know what it is." But Ava could feel it. The darkness in the air, the way it clung to the edges of her thoughts, urging her forward. She didn't know if they were ready, but there was no turning back now. The figure, the thing watching them, wasn't going to let them leave. Not unless they did something about it. And the longer they waited, the stronger it became. She stepped forward, forcing herself to move despite the dread that threatened to paralyze her. "It's waiting for us," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We're connected, and it won't stop until it pulls us back in. We have to sever the link once and for all." Maya's eyes met Ava's, understanding flickering in her gaze, though fear still lingered in her features. "So we have to destroy it?" Again, Ava nodded, her voice unwavering. "Yes, but this time we don't just destroy the altar. We destroy whatever's feeding off of us, whatever has attached itself to us." Liam swallowed hard, then looked toward the figure again. It was still there, unmoving, but it seemed to be growing darker, more solid, like it was materializing before them. Ava couldn't tell if it was moving or if it was just the shifting fog around it, but she could feel the pull, the unnatural force drawing her in. "I don't like this," Liam muttered, his voice tight with fear. "But I don't think we have a choice." They all turned their gaze back toward the altar. It seemed so simple in the moonlight, just a chunk of stone, cracked and worn with time. But Ava knew it wasn't just stone, it was a conduit. It was the key to the thing that was holding them all in its grip. Ava stepped up to the altar and knelt, her fingers brushing against the cracked stone. The moment she touched it, she felt a sudden surge of energy, a pull, sharp and insistent, like the stone was alive, like it was feeding off of her. "No," she whispered, pulling her hand away. She could feel it now, deeper than before, the connection between her and the forest. "We need to destroy the bond. Now." Liam and Maya stepped forward, each of them reaching for the stone, their hands trembling but determined. Together, they placed their palms on the altar. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and the fog parted briefly, but the figure was still there, waiting. Then, the ground beneath them rumbled. A deep, growling sound, as though the earth itself was waking up. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a cacophony, louder, sharper, filling their heads with voices they couldn't understand. Ava could feel it clawing at her mind, pushing against the edges of her sanity. It was trying to break her down, trying to make her listen. But she couldn't. Not this time. "Ava." Maya's voice trembled beside her. "What do we do?" Ava looked up, her eyes wide with desperation. "We have to burn it. Burn everything. The altar, the stone, the connection." Maya nodded quickly. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a lighter, its flame flickering in the wind. With shaking hands, she leaned over and touched the flame to the cracks in the stone. The fire didn't catch at first. Then, with a sudden flash, the altar erupted into flames, blue and green fire twisting and spiraling upward, feeding off the stone's dark energy. The earth shook violently beneath them as the fire roared higher, and the whispers turned into a maddening shriek that filled the air. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a storm, but they didn't move. They couldn't. The figure in the distance began to dissolve, its form breaking apart, vanishing into the air as though it was being consumed by the fire. But still, the ground shook, and the energy felt oppressive, like it wasn't over yet. Ava's heart pounded as the flames roared higher, the intense heat making the air thick with smoke. But still, the force pressed in on her, clinging to her skin, her mind. She gritted her teeth and stepped forward, reaching out to the fire. Sever the link. A sudden surge of energy exploded from the altar, sending a shockwave through the clearing. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, the earth groaning like it was about to swallow them whole. Ava's body jerked forward as if something was trying to pull her back, but she fought it. She had to. And then, in one final, deafening burst, the flames consumed everything. The world went black. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid smell of burning wood and earth making it hard to breathe. Ava gasped, her chest heaving, as she stumbled backward. The force of the explosion had thrown her off balance, but somehow she managed to stay on her feet. The ground trembled beneath her, but it wasn't like before. This was different. The earth was no longer angry, no longer alive with a malevolent force. The oppressive weight that had pressed on her chest for so long was gone. Ava looked around, trying to focus through the smoke and the haze of the fading fire. The altar had completely disappeared. Where it once stood, there was only charred earth, the remnants of a once ancient stone structure now reduced to nothing but ash. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers stopped. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled. The haunting voices that had tormented them for days, the voices that had clawed at their minds and manipulated their thoughts, were finally silent. Ava stood there, blinking against the smoke, her heart pounding. "Is it over?" she whispered to herself. But the question was heavy in the air, a sense of uncertainty clinging to her. Maya was the first to speak, her voice raw from the smoke, but filled with cautious relief. "I think it is." Liam, still wide-eyed and panting, wiped his brow. We did it. But before he could finish his sentence, the ground beneath them groaned again, louder this time. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she looked down, the earth shifting beneath her feet like it was alive, like it was pulling them deeper into its dark heart. "Ava," Maya asked, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Ava replied, her throat dry. The air around them had gone cold again, the atmosphere oppressive as it had been before. It wasn't the same, but it was something. She felt it creeping back, a presence. But it was different now. It was more distant, like it was still there, but not as close. And then the fog rolled back in, thicker this time, swirling around them like a wall. From within the mist, something shifted, a shape emerging, moving slowly through the dense fog. Ava's heart clenched in her chest as she recognized the outline. A figure, tall, shadowed, and unmistakably there. It wasn't the same as before. This time, the figure wasn't standing still. It was moving toward them, and it was not alone. The shadows shifted again, and Ava saw more forms emerging from the fog, figures that seemed to stretch unnaturally tall, moving in unison, like they were bound together by some unseen force. They came closer, their features indistinct, but their presence unmistakably chilling. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Liam stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" "It's them," Maya whispered. "It's the forest." But it's not just the forest anymore. Ava's mind raced. The fire had burned the altar, yes, but something had escaped during the destruction. It wasn't just the forest they had released, it was something older, something that had been dormant, buried deep within the earth. The fire had severed the immediate connection, but it had unleashed something else, something that had been waiting, buried beneath the surface. The figures moved closer, their bodies unnaturally thin, their limbs bending at strange angles, like they were only half-formed shadows that shifted too fluidly. The air around them was thick with cold, and Ava could feel the air press down on her chest, as though the very space was tightening, pulling them in. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. Now, the silence between the figures felt suffocating, heavy, like it was pulling at the edges of her thoughts, as though it was trying to drag her into their realm. Ava took a shaky step back. What? What do they want? Maya didn't look away from the figures, her face pale. "I don't think they're here to talk. They're here to finish what we started." Ava's eyes darted to Liam, who was looking around in panic. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. "This, whatever this is, it's not something we can handle. Not like this." But Ava didn't move. She couldn't move. The figures were too close now. She could feel them, feel their presence pressing in on her, pushing into her skin. There was a chill that ran down her spine. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. Its body twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, its features still indistinct, but its presence suffocating. And then the voice. It was a voice not of words, but of thoughts, a deep, resonant hum that filled their minds all at once, vibrating through the ground beneath them, making Ava's bones ache. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand." The voice echoed in her mind, and a flood of visions crashed over her. Images of the forest, stretching out in every direction, ancient roots twisting deep into the earth, reaching up into the sky. The figures were part of it, part of something much larger, older. They were not just the forest. They were the very essence of it, the force that had been dormant, waiting for them to awaken it. The voice, or whatever it was, continued. "The bond is unbroken. It has merely evolved. And you, You have only begun to see the truth. The figures moved closer, and Ava felt herself being pulled toward them, her body frozen in place, unable to fight the force. The fog was thick now, swirling around her, almost suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Ava, run." Maya's voice broke through the fog, sharp and panicked. But Ava couldn't move. She couldn't even speak. It was as if the very air was pressing against her, locking her in place, drawing her closer to the figures. Her body felt as if it were being pulled apart, her mind too small to contain the weight of what was happening. And then she saw it. A faint light in the distance, too far to reach, but it was there. Something calling her. She didn't know if it was hope or despair, but it was something she had to reach for. With a final surge of willpower, she broke free from the grip, pushing through the suffocating fog. "We need to go. Now," she screamed, her voice desperate. Maya and Liam hesitated. Then, without a word, they turned and ran. The figures in the fog remained, watching, waiting. Ava didn't dare look back. They ran through the thick fog, their feet pounding against the earth as the shadows of the figures remained behind them, closing in. She couldn't hear the whispers anymore, only her heart pounding in her ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the fog started to thin. The figures, the forest, the oppressive energy, it all started to fade, as if the earth itself was letting them go. They reached the edge of the forest, gasping for air, their limbs trembling. Ava turned back, her heart still pounding, but the mist had receded. The figures were gone. The forest stood silent once more. But Ava didn't feel relieved. She felt as though they had narrowly escaped something far worse, something they didn't fully understand. The forest wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. They had only just begun. The dense fog had begun to dissipate, but the tension in the air still lingered. Ava, Maya, and Liam stood at the edge of the forest, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear, their eyes darting back toward the now silent trees. The forest, once so imposing, now appeared deceptively calm, like a predator biding its time. The shadows of the figures they had seen were gone, but the weight of their presence pressed heavily on their minds. Ava's thoughts were racing. What had they just escaped? Had they really destroyed the connection, or had they only pushed it deeper into the earth, hidden from sight for now? The voice had warned them that the bond wasn't truly broken, only evolved. She shuddered at the thought. What did that mean? Was the forest truly alive, waiting for them to come back? Was it waiting to claim them again, more insidiously this time? Her mind kept circling back to that strange vision she had received, the deep roots, the twisting branches, the sense that whatever they had awoken, whatever they had tried to destroy, was part of something far greater, something ancient. They had set something in motion, something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Ava," Maya's voice cut through her thoughts, soft but urgent. "What's happening to us? What did we just do?" Ava turned to look at her friend. Maya's face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Her breath was shaky, and she looked as though she might crumble under the weight of it all. "I don't know," Ava said, her own voice unsteady. "I don't know what we've done, but I do know one thing. We can't go back. We can't ever go back into that forest. Not without understanding what we've unleashed." Liam was pacing now, his hands running through his hair as he muttered to himself. "This is insane. We almost died in there. Whatever that thing was, it's not over. We don't know what we're dealing with. We need to leave. We need to tell someone." Ava shook her head, her throat tight. "No one will believe us. And even if they did, they wouldn't know how to stop it. The forest is alive, Liam. It's not just some place with trees. It's something older, something we woke up." Maya stepped closer to her, her expression filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Then what do we do? We can't just leave it like this. Whatever we awakened, it's not just going to disappear because we're not in the woods anymore." Ava hesitated, looking out over the tree line. The sky above them was clouded, dim, as if the sun had been dimmed by some unseen force. The air felt thicker, like it was pressing down on them. She felt a shiver run through her, like a cold hand brushing the back of her neck. We need to learn more. We need to understand what this is, where it came from, and how to stop it before it comes for us again. Ava's voice was firm, though her insides were trembling. The more we know, the better chance we'll have at stopping it. Liam stopped pacing, turning to face her with an incredulous look. You want us to go back? You want us to go back into that place after everything we just saw? No, Ava said quickly. I'm not suggesting we go back to the forest, at least not yet. But we need answers, and there's one place I know we can find them. Maya's brow furrowed. Where? Ava took a deep breath. There's a local historian, an old man who knows more about this forest than anyone else. He's been studying it for decades. If anyone knows what we're up against, it's him. Liam's eyes narrowed in suspicion. And you think he's just going to tell us? After everything that's happened? Do you really think he knows something we don't? I don't know, Ava admitted, the doubt creeping into her voice. But we have to try. If there's any chance he can help us understand what's happening, we need to take it. I can't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to come for us again. Maya nodded slowly, her fear mingled with the glimmer of resolve in her eyes. You're right. We can't just keep running. We need to figure out what we're dealing with before it's too late. Liam let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping in resignation. All right, I'm in. But if this guy doesn't know anything, I'm out. I'm not spending another second in the woods if I don't have to. Ava gave a slight, appreciative nod. Thank you. Together, they started walking away from the forest, their footsteps heavy against the damp earth. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Even as they left the clearing behind, the weight of the forest seemed to follow them, like a presence lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they reached the road, Ava glanced back one last time. The forest stood silent, its towering trees like silent sentinels in the distance. But Ava knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The forest had stirred, and it wouldn't rest until it had what it wanted. And Ava had no idea what that was. They arrived at the historian's house later that evening, after a long drive through winding roads and darkened streets. The house was old, weathered by time, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and the windows dimly lit from within. It looked like something out of a ghost story, lonely, isolated, and steeped in secrets. Ava took a deep breath before knocking on the door. She was still uncertain whether this man would have any answers, or whether they were just chasing shadows. But she knew they had no other choice. They couldn't ignore what they had seen, what they felt in the forest. Whatever the truth was, they had to face it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man in his late 60s. His eyes were sharp, despite his age, and there was a quiet, knowing expression on his face, as though he had been expecting them. I've been waiting for you, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Come in. We have much to discuss. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. Somehow, she knew that from this moment on, there would be no turning back. They stepped inside, and the door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing their fate. The air inside the historian's house was heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with books, maps, and strange artifacts that looked out of place in a typical home. The dim, flickering light from a single lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows that made the place feel more like a sanctuary for secrets than a place of comfort. Ava, Maya, and Liam stood just inside the threshold, glancing around cautiously. The historian's home felt both welcoming and unsettling, a strange combination of warmth and coldness that sent an eerie chill through the air. Ava could sense that something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Her skin prickled as though the very walls were watching them. The man who had opened the door didn't invite them to sit. Instead, he motioned for them to follow him deeper into the house. He didn't seem surprised by their arrival, almost as if he had been expecting them all along. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this had all been set in motion long before they even realized it. We'll speak in my study, he said, his voice as firm as it was gravelly. "There's no time to waste." Without waiting for a response, he turned and moved down a narrow corridor, his steps steady and purposeful. Ava exchanged a brief, unsure glance with Maya and Liam before following. The study was at the back of the house, the walls lined with more books, some ancient, others relatively new. But the centerpiece of the room was a large, circular wooden table covered in yellowed papers, maps, and odd trinkets. At the center of the table was an open book, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The historian gestured to it without speaking, his eyes narrowing as he watched them approach. Ava leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. The book looked old, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages frayed and torn at the edges. It was clear that this book had been used for decades, maybe even longer. It held the kind of knowledge that could not be found in typical history books. The historian cleared his throat, finally speaking. "I imagine you have many questions. About the forest. About what you've encountered." He paused, his eyes flickering toward each of them in turn. "And I imagine you also have no idea what you've truly awakened." Ava swallowed hard. We don't understand it all. But whatever it is, it's still out there. We saw it. The forest is not just a forest," the historian interrupted, his voice low and gravely serious. "It's a boundary, a barrier, a living, breathing entity." His voice dropped to a whisper, and for a moment, Ava felt the room grow colder, the shadows around them darker. "It's been waiting," Liam scoffed, looking at the historian with disbelief. "Waiting for what?" "For the moment when it could escape." The historian's eyes locked onto Liam's, as though searching for some kind of understanding. "The forest isn't just a collection of trees, leaves, and dirt. It's a place of power, a conduit to something much older. The forest was built upon an ancient power, a dark force that predates even human civilization." Ava could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. Escape? The forest had been waiting to escape? "There are things beneath the earth," the historian continued, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Things we were never meant to disturb. We've lived alongside it, with its whispers in the dark, the strange patterns in the trees, the odd occurrences. But we kept our distance. We didn't poke at it, we didn't question it. Until you came." Ava felt a chill creep up her spine. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We didn't know what we were dealing with." The historian nodded grimly. "And that was the mistake. The fire you set at the altar. It was meant to sever the connection, but it didn't. You only triggered something far worse." His fingers traced the edge of the open book. "The ritual you interrupted, that was only one part of a much larger design." "Design?" Maya asked, her voice shaking. "What design?" The historian hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to tell them. Then, with a slow exhale, he reached into a drawer of the desk and pulled out an old, tattered map. The ink had faded, but the outlines were still visible of the land, the forest, and something else. Something hidden. "This is an old map," the historian said. "It predates all of your written records. It shows not just the forest, but the entire region, its history, its purpose. This was once a sacred place for an ancient civilization, long before our time." Ava leaned over to study the map. It looked like something out of fantasy story, lines that connected parts of the land, symbols that she didn't understand, and, at the center, a large circle that surrounded the very forest they had just fled. "It's a seal," the historian explained. "The forest is the heart of an ancient power, and the land you've now crossed, the land you've disturbed, is a place where something darker is sealed away. The forest was never meant to be disturbed. It was supposed to remain locked. That altar, the one you destroyed, was the key to maintaining that seal." Ava's head spun. "A key? A seal? What had they done?" Maya's voice cracked as she spoke. "So, we opened it." The historian nodded. "Yes, and now you've unleashed something that was never meant to be free. Whatever that thing was in the forest, it was just one fragment, There are more, many more, and if the forest power is fully restored, they will all be released. Liam stepped back, shaking his head. No, that's not possible. What do we even do now? We've barely survived one of these things, and you're telling us there are more? The historian met Liam's gaze with a hard, grim look. You don't have a choice. The forest will not forget. It will come after you, and it will come after anyone in its path until the seal is restored. Ava felt her knees weaken. How do we stop it? The historian's eyes darkened. There is only one way. You must find the remaining altars. The others, there are 3 left, hidden in the land. Only by destroying each altar can you sever the connection for good. And you must act quickly. The longer you wait, the stronger the force will grow. It's already too late for some. Ava's heart sank. The gravity of what he was saying was settling in. They hadn't just disrupted something dangerous. They had unleashed an ancient evil that was now hunting them. Her voice was barely a whisper. Where are these other altars? The historian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for another sheet of paper, a journal entry, hastily scribbled with a sense of urgency. He handed it to her. This is what I've been working on for the last 20 years. The locations of the altars, marked by those who came before you. The ones who tried and failed. Ava looked down at the paper. The locations of the altars were marked, each one tied to an ancient site. The first one they had destroyed had been in the center of the forest, but there were others scattered throughout the region, hidden in plain sight. Ava felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. They couldn't stop now. They had no choice but to go on. The historian stood, his face grave. If you fail to destroy the altars, the forest will reclaim what you've taken, and then nothing will be left. Ava's mind raced as she held the map in her hands. The weight of what the historian had just told them was nearly unbearable. There was no time to process the enormity of it all, no time for fear to set in. They were already deep in something far beyond their control, and the only way out was to face it head on. She glanced at Maya and Liam. Both of them looked just as overwhelmed as she felt, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that came with the realization that they were now part of something much larger than themselves. What do we do now? Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. How do we even begin to find these altars? The historian's gaze softened slightly, but there was no warmth in his expression. You must be careful. The altars are not easy to find, nor are they meant to be found. The land has concealed them for centuries. They are tied to the earth, to its very bones. Only those who know how to listen to its whispers can uncover their locations. Ava's fingers tightened around the map. But you said others have tried before us. What happened to them? The historian sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime spent seeking answers. Those who came before you, archaeologists, historians, even spiritualists, believed they were simply searching for relics for knowledge. They never understood the true nature of the forest, and they didn't understand the cost of disturbing the seal. They failed in the forest. It took them. A shiver ran down Ava's spine. Took them. The historian nodded gravely. The forest doesn't just kill. It absorbs, it consumes. Once you've disturbed the balance, there is no escaping it. Those who fail to stop it become part of the forest. The land claims them. Some say their voices can still be heard, whispering in the wind, calling out to those who are foolish enough to listen. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The idea of what they were up against, of what they had already seen, was enough to break anyone. But they couldn't afford to break now. Not when the fate of everything, their world, their lives, their very survival, hung in the balance. We need to start now, Ava said, her voice firm, though she could feel her heart hammering in her chest. We can't waste any more time. If there's a chance to stop this, we have to take it. Liam nodded, though he still looked uneasy. I don't know about you, but I'm not exactly looking forward to chasing down altars in the middle of nowhere. But if it means stopping whatever that thing is in the woods, then yeah, I guess we don't have much of a choice. Maya turned to the historian. How do we know where to go first? How can we even trust these maps? The historian's eyes darkened, his expression growing even more somber. You must trust your instincts. The altars will reveal themselves when you're ready. But be warned, there will be obstacles. The forest won't let you pass without a fight. He paused, as though considering whether or not to share more. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "And there's one other thing you must know. There's a cost to every altar. A price. You may lose pieces of yourself along the way, memories, pieces of your soul. The forest feeds on fear, and it will use everything it can to weaken you." Ava felt her stomach twist at the thought. A price? The idea of losing more, of sacrificing pieces of herself, was almost too much to bear. But she knew that if they didn't stop this, there would be no more selves left to lose. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke. "What if we can't make it in time? What if we fail?" The historian met her gaze, his eyes sharp, filled with an ancient knowledge that sent a chill down her spine. "You must not fail. If the seal breaks completely, if the forest claims its full power, there will be nothing left of this world. No one will remember you. No one will even know what happened." Ava felt a sense of urgency rising within her. "We can't let that happen. We'll find the altars. We'll destroy them." The historian nodded slowly, his hands resting on the edges of the table, fingers tapping lightly. "I hope you're right. But remember, the forest is patient. It will wait, and it will try to break you. Stay strong. Trust each other. And above all, never forget that you're not alone in this." Ava nodded, trying to absorb everything he had said. She didn't know how or if they could succeed, but she couldn't walk away. "Not now. We'll be careful," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "We'll stay together, and we'll stop this." With that, the historian handed them the map and the journal, along with a few other odds and ends, old trinkets, amulets, and talismans that he claimed would offer them protection. "They will not stop the forest completely," he warned, "but they may give you some small advantage." They left the historian's house shortly after, the weight of their task sinking deeper with each step. As they walked back toward their car, Ava glanced at the map once more, tracing the locations of the altars. They were scattered across the land, distant from each other, each hidden in a place that seemed more remote than the last. The first altar, the one they had already destroyed, was the most dangerous, an ancient, potent source of power. The others, scattered across abandoned sites, old ruins, and forgotten lands, were also dangerous but seemed more dormant for now. But Ava couldn't help but wonder how long that would last. As they drove away from the historian's house, Ava turned to look at the horizon, where the setting sun bathed the world in a deep, blood-red hue. A storm was coming, one that would test them in ways they couldn't yet understand. And no matter how hard she tried to reassure herself, she couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of her mind. The forest was already waiting. The drive felt endless. The road stretched out before them, winding through the darkening countryside, but Ava couldn't focus on the landscape anymore. Her mind was locked in a frantic whirl, replaying everything the historian had said, the altars, the price, the forest that had been waiting, watching. The thought of whatever ancient force they had disturbed now hunting them made her skin crawl. They couldn't outrun it, not forever. And what was worse, she wasn't sure they could outsmart it. Maya sat quietly beside her in the passenger seat, her fingers twisted together in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since leaving the historian's house. Ava knew her well enough to see the fear bubbling just below the surface. Maya had always been the rational one, the skeptic. But now, Ava could see the cracks in that armor. Liam was in the back seat, staring out the window, his eyes distant. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the historian's house either, but his silence was different. It was a guarded kind of silence, the kind you put up when you're trying not to think about the things that make you want to scream. Ava swallowed, forcing herself to focus on the road. It was hard to keep her mind in the present when the past few hours felt like a blur. like they had crossed some invisible line into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The forest had always been something of a mystery, something that had lurked in the background of their lives, but now it was front and center, and they had no choice but to deal with it. Finally, after what felt like hours, Maya spoke, her voice soft but insistent. "Ava, what are we supposed to do? We can't just go wandering around, looking for altars. We have no idea where they are, or what we're up against." Ava kept her eyes on the road, but felt her throat tighten. "I know. We'll have to figure it out as we go. But the map the historian gave us, it's a starting point, and if we're careful, we can follow the clues. But we have no idea what we're really dealing with," Maya countered. "How can we fight something we don't even understand?" Liam turned around, his expression hard, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface, something like fear. The guy made it sound like the forest will fight back, like it's not just trees and roots, but something alive. We've already seen it once. I'm not ready to go face whatever else is out there. Ava's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She had to keep it together. For them. For herself. "We don't have a choice, Liam. If we don't do this, if we don't try to stop it, then we might as well be signing our own death warrants. We can't let it spread. We can't let whatever that thing is take over everything." The silence in the car was heavy. The reality of their situation had settled in, a cold weight pressing on all of them. No one spoke again as they continued their journey. By the time they reached the first location on the map, it was well past midnight. They had driven for hours, the car's headlights cutting through the thick darkness, the landscape stretching endlessly before them. Ava could barely remember the last time they'd stopped for gas or food. They had no intention of stopping again anytime soon. The place they had come to was a ruined church, long abandoned and forgotten. The stone structure was crumbling, ivy and moss overtaking its once proud walls. It looked like the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old horror movie, desolate, eerie, and somehow wrong. Ava parked the car a little ways down the road, not wanting to drive too close to the church. She felt an unsettling pull, like the land itself was warning them away. "Are you sure this is the place?" Maya asked, her voice laced with doubt. Ava nodded, glancing at the map one more time. "This is it. The first altar is supposed to be here, hidden somewhere inside. The historian said we would know when we were close." Liam was already out of the car, his eyes scanning the abandoned church with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "It looks like a damned ghost town. Just stay alert," Ava said, getting out and closing the door behind her. The historian said the forest won't make this easy. They walked toward the church, the air growing thicker with every step. The further they got from the car, the more the hairs on the back of Ava's neck stood up. It wasn't just the silence of the place. It was something else. The forest was close, and she could feel it pressing in from all sides, as if the trees were reaching out, listening. They reached the church's entrance, a rotting wooden door hanging loosely on its hinges. Ava pushed it open, the creak of wood cutting through the quiet like a scream. The inside was dark, save for the faint light from their flashlights. The remnants of stained glass windows cast ghostly patterns on the stone floor, but it wasn't the beauty of the place that caught Ava's attention. It was the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the air. The longer they stood there, the more she felt like something was waiting in the shadows, watching them. "I don't like this," Liam muttered, his voice low. "It feels wrong." Maya nodded, her face pale. "It feels like the whole place is alive, like it's watching us." Ava's pulse quickened, but she didn't say anything. The historian had warned them. The forest had power, and the altars were places of ancient magic, places where that power gathered. They had to press on. She led the way, her flashlight beam flicking across the cracked stone walls and broken pews. At the far end of the church, near the altar, something caught her eye. A symbol carved into the stone floor, just beneath where the altar had once stood. It was faint, but unmistakable. The same symbol she had seen in the historian's book. The one he'd warned them about. "This is it," Ava said quietly, pointing it out to the others. Liam and Maya moved closer, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "What is it?" Maya asked. "I don't know," Ava admitted. "But it looks like the symbol of the seal. This is what was holding the power back. The altar is here." Liam took a step back, his eyes scanning the room. "This place gives me the creeps. What are we supposed to do now?" Ava didn't know, but as she looked around, she felt a cold wind whip through the church, one that wasn't there before. The feeling of being watched grew stronger until it became a suffocating presence. She could almost hear the faintest whispers, like a voice carried on the wind. "It's here." The whisper echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. Her eyes widened as she turned to face the others. They hadn't heard it. And then, the floor beneath them groaned. Ava's heart skipped a beat as the ground trembled beneath her feet. The deep, echoing groan came again, louder this time, reverberating through the old stone walls. The air grew cold, so cold it felt as if the very atmosphere had turned to ice. Her breath came out in shallow, visible bursts, and the whispers, those faint, eerie voices, seemed to draw closer, as if the forest itself had sensed something to watch them. What the hell was that? Maya hissed, her voice shaking. She grabbed onto Ava's arm, her grip tight as she pulled her back toward the door. Ava couldn't take her eyes off the symbol on the floor. It was glowing faintly now, a dull, otherworldly light pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the cracked stone. She felt something, a magnetic pull, urging her to step forward, to get closer. "No," Ava said, shaking her head. "We can't run. This is it. The altar's here, and if we're going to stop this, we have to figure out how to..." The floor cracked, and before she could finish her sentence, a jagged fissure split through the stone. The ground shook again, this time with more intensity. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and a loud, grinding sound echoed from deep beneath the church. "What's happening?" Liam shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. He backed away, but there was nowhere to retreat. They were cornered in the church now, the walls closing in, the air thickening with an unnatural pressure. Then, with a deafening crack, the symbol on the floor flared with light, and the ground beneath them splintered open, revealing a deep, dark chasm. Ava's breath hitched as something moved within it. Something ancient. Something alive. The whispers, which had been a faint murmur, grew louder, now a chorus of distorted voices, all speaking in unison. "Come to us. Come to us, children of the earth." The words slithered in Ava's mind, like a tongue brushing against the inside of her skull. A command, a beckoning. Her heart raced. The historian's warning echoed in her mind, louder now than ever before. Once you disturb the balance, there is no going back. Ava took a step forward, drawn to the darkness below. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself. There was something pulling her, something cold and malevolent. The air was thick with dread, yet she couldn't fight the compulsion to step closer, to peer into the abyss that now lay beneath them. "Ava, stop!" Maya cried, her voice full of panic. "Don't go any closer. Whatever it is, it's not." But Ava couldn't hear her. Her senses were overwhelmed, consumed by the pull of the abyss. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she hovered just above the gaping crack in the floor. Then, in an instant, something shot up from the chasm, a dark, twisting shadow, a tendril of blackness that reached out like a viper's strike. It snaked through the air with terrifying speed, its cold, suffocating grip wrapping around her wrist before she could react. Ava gasped, her breath stolen by the icy touch. "Ava!" Liam screamed. He lunged forward, grabbing her other arm in a desperate attempt to pull her back. But it was too late. The shadow tightened, pulling her toward the chasm. Her feet left the ground, and she was dragged toward the dark void. Her vision spun as the ground below her disappeared into a whirl of darkness, the blackness swallowing everything. Maya screamed, but Ava couldn't hear her anymore. The whispering voices filled her mind, their words incoherent but undeniably insistent. They were speaking to her, calling to her. She felt her consciousness slip, her body growing weightless as the shadow dragged her down into the abyss. And then, a sharp, violent pull. The darkness seemed to close in on her, and for a moment, everything went still. Ava's eyes fluttered open, her breath ragged, her body cold. She could feel the weight of the ground beneath her, the rough, uneven surface of stone pressing into her back. Her mind was foggy, disoriented, but one thing was clear: she was no longer in the church. She sat up quickly, her pulse racing. The shadows around her were darker than anything she had ever seen, as if the night itself had taken shape. The air was thick, suffocating with an unnatural weight. She was surrounded by a forest, but this wasn't the forest she remembered. These trees were twisted, contorted into grotesque shapes, their bark black and gnarled like something out of a nightmare. The branches reached out like skeletal hands, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky. "Ava!" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A cold, hollow whisper that seemed to echo in the air around her. Ava's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't alone. The figure in front of her was barely human. Its shape was distorted, its form half hidden in the darkness. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Ava could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on her. It was like a dream or a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist but did. The whisper came again, this time more clear. "You've come." Ava's body trembled as she tried to stand, but her legs felt weak, as if the very ground beneath her was sapping her strength. "What do you want?" Ava demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, the words shaky as she tried to summon some semblance of courage. She had to fight, had to resist whatever this was. The figure tilted its head, the shadows shifting around it like liquid darkness. "You seek the altars, but you're too late, child. The seal is already broken." Ava's blood ran cold. The seal. The figure's lips curled into a twisted, grotesque smile. "The forest is awake, and now, you belong to it." In an instant, the shadows around her lunged forward, tendrils of darkness wrapping around her limbs, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The last thing Ava saw before she was consumed by the shadows, the twisted figure's face, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. And then everything went dark. Ava's world was a swirl of blackness, a void so complete she couldn't tell if she was still breathing. Her limbs felt heavy, as though shackled by the very air itself. Every thought she had seemed to dissolve into the endless dark, and the whispers, the voices, became louder, more insistent, filling her head with their clamoring demands. She had no sense of time, no sense of reality. The darkness seemed endless, stretching out before her like a vast ocean. It was suffocating, consuming her. And then, through the fog of fear and confusion, she felt something. A presence. Not alone. The shadows tugged at her mind, pulling her deeper into the void. She struggled, trying to move, but the weight of the darkness was too much. Something was shifting inside her. A sense of loss, of being swallowed whole. Memories, pieces of herself, began to slip away like sand falling through her fingers, impossible to grasp. The sensation was terrifying, the realization that she might never see light again more so. And then a pull. It was as if the darkness itself had torn open, unraveling her from the suffocating grip of the shadows. Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe again. She gasped, blinking into the dim light. Her surroundings had changed. The forest was gone. She was back in the church, the crumbling ruin they had entered hours earlier. But it was different now. The air was thick with rot. The stone floor cracked wider, as though the earth itself was being eaten alive. The light was fading, as if the world around her was dimming. The altar symbol on the floor still glowed faintly, but the ground beneath it had deepened, twisted, and there were more cracks now, more fissures in the stone that seemed to pulse with unnatural energy. It's not over. Ava's chest tightened, the weight of the realization sinking into her bones. Whatever had happened, the chasm, the darkness, it wasn't just a trial. It was a transformation. She wasn't just battling some dark force in the woods anymore. She had become part of it. The forest had claimed its first victim. But that didn't mean the others were lost. She could still hear Maya's voice, faint, coming from somewhere far off. Liam, too. She couldn't lose them, not like this. Not now. Ava forced herself to stand, her legs shaking as if they hadn't borne weight in years. She could still feel the coldness of the shadows on her skin, but she pushed through it, her mind clearing in the process. She had to fix this. She had to stop the curse, no matter the cost. She turned toward the chasm, its dark moss still open. Her fingers twitched as she reached toward it, knowing that somehow, deep down, this was where the answer lay. The pull was undeniable, like the call of something ancient and powerful, something not quite human, yet all too familiar. As her fingers brushed the edge of the altar's symbol, the ground beneath her groaned once more. Ava's heart slammed in her chest as the stone trembled. A voice, one she recognized, whispered through her mind. "Ava, don't do it." It was Maya. Ava turned, and there they were, Maya and Liam, standing in the doorway. Both of them were pale, their eyes wide with terror, but they were alive. "What happened to you?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and fear. What did you see?" Ava swallowed hard, taking a step back from the altar. "It's not just a forest, Maya. It's the seal. It's been broken. And I don't know if we can stop it. Not anymore." Liam stepped forward, his face grim. "So what now? We just wait for it to take everything." Ava looked at the altar, then at her friends. "No, we can't let it consume us. The forest, whatever it is, it's waiting for us to give in. But we have to fight back." Maya glanced at the cracks in the floor, the glow of the symbol growing stronger. How do we even begin to fight something this powerful? Ava's mind raced, and then, with a flicker of thought, she knew. She had seen something the historian had warned them about. A price for each altar. It had been buried deep in her subconscious, but now it surged to the surface. The key to stopping this. "The price," she said slowly, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "The price we pay. It's part of the solution. The forest feeds on fear, on loss. If we can make the sacrifice, if we're willing to give something up, maybe we can stop it." Liam shook his head. "What do you mean? We give up our memories? Our souls?" Ava nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. "Yes, but it's the only way. We can't fight this with force. We can't outsmart it. We have to let it go. Whatever is holding us here. Whatever has tied us to the forest." She felt the power in the air surge once more, as though it were responding to her words. The whispers grew louder, clawing at the edges of her mind, but this time, Ava felt a strange clarity. Maya stepped closer, her face pale, but determined. "We're with you, whatever it takes." Liam hesitated, his eyes darting between them. "If we do this, there's no going back, right?" Ava met his gaze, the finality of her words clear. "No, but if we don't, there won't be anything left to save." A deep, hollow silence hung between them. Then, one by one, they stepped forward, each of them reaching out toward the altar. The ground rumbled, as if acknowledging their decision. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, the chasm beneath them yawning wider, threatening to swallow them whole. But this time, Ava didn't feel fear. She felt the weight of the moment, a decision to sacrifice, to sever themselves from the very forces that had sought to consume them. With a final breath, they let go. The ground shook violently, and the forest's power howled in fury. The air was thick, electric with the force of the seal being undone. The altar cracked open, a burst of light exploding from the ground like a bolt of lightning. And then, just as quickly, everything went silent. Ava opened her eyes, her body trembling, but she was no longer in the church. The forest was gone. The darkness had lifted. They stood in a field under a starry sky, the ground firm beneath their feet. The world was still. The air was calm. And for the first time, they felt it. The weight that had been pressing down on them for so long was finally gone. The forest's grip had loosened, and the altars, once a source of unimaginable power, were nothing more than memories now. Far away, buried beneath layers of time and shadow. They had won, but there was no victory song, no celebration. They were free, yes, but at what cost? As Ava stood there, looking at her friends, she knew that some battles weren't won with triumph. Some battles were won with loss. And in the end, they would carry those scars forever.